Alright, hello again, fellow sapiens. Tonight, we sail past the edge of the map into an island that rewrote the human blueprint. Between 150,000 years ago and 50,000 years ago, a tiny kind of human lived in the caves of Flores, barely a metre tall, careful hands, flint-bright minds. They hunted giant rats beneath silent stalks, watched dragons in the ferns, and built a life no one expected. We call them Homo FLORESIENSIS, the Hobbits of the Ice Age. This is Sleepless Homo, soft science and slow storytelling for tired thinkers. Here we don't sensationalize evolution, we unfold it, quietly, in sequence, stone by stone, ash by ash, a fingertip of bone that changes the way we think about being human. Tonight's question is simple and unsettling. How does isolation remake a species? On Flores, bodies shrank, brains reorganized, and survival became an art of less. Fewer calories, smaller tools, tighter circles around the fire. No DNA has survived to speak for them, but the cave has a memory. Now imagine walking into a cave and meeting another kind of human, one you never expected. The air is cool, the limestone walls whisper, and in the dust at your feet lies a skeleton no taller than your waist. Its skull, delicate yet ancient, holds a brain the size of a grapefruit. Its jaw juts forward slightly, its limbs are short and strong, and every bone seems to belong to a story that shouldn't exist. In the year 2003, on the Indonesian island of Flores, archaeologists brushed the soil from this small frame and quietly realized that the world had just become stranger. They had found a human, but not a modern one. It was an adult woman who had lived tens of thousands of years ago, standing barely over 1 metre tall. Her discoverers named her Liang Bua Cave, after the cave that had protected her for nearly 50 millennia. To the world, she would soon be known by a different name, the Hobbit. The excavation began like many others, a slow, methodical dig into ancient sediments, layer by layer. The team from Indonesia's National Research Centre for Archaeology, working with Australian researchers from the University of New England, expected to find evidence of early modern humans, perhaps tools, charcoal, or fragments of bone. What they uncovered instead was something that didn't fit any known pattern. The skeleton that emerged from the limestone floor was too small, too primitive, and too complete. Her skull was roughly 1/3 the volume of a modern human's. Her arms were long, her legs were short, and her feet were disproportionately large, almost as if she'd been built for another kind of terrain. The excavators were stunned. For a moment they wondered if this could be a child's skeleton, perhaps stunted by malnutrition or disease. But as they examined the bones, the truth settled in. This was an adult. The teeth had fully erupted and worn down. The pelvis was mature. Whatever this being was, she had lived to adulthood as part of a population of very small humans. For the first time in decades, paleoanthropologists had to redraw the map of humanity. Until then, the prevailing wisdom had been that by around 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had spread across much of the world, and that all other human species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and earlier forms of Homo erectus, had vanished. Flores, a remote island east of Java, was not expected to yield surprises. Yet here was a skeleton that upended that timeline entirely. The bones suggested a lineage that had split from our own deep in the past, and somehow survived in isolation far longer than anyone thought possible. It was as if a ghost from the early Pleistocene had lingered into the late Ice Age. The context only deepened the mystery. The cave of Liang Bua sits in the lush hills of western Flores, a region of steep valleys and tropical rainforest. Excavations revealed not just one skeleton, but the remains of at least several individuals, along with stone tools scattered through multiple layers of sediment. radiometric dating placed the fossils between roughly 100,000 and 60,000 years ago, with stone artifacts continuing until about 50,000 years ago. This meant that these small humans had been alive long after Homo erectus disappeared from Java, and almost at the same time that our own species was entering Australia. They were, quite literally, our neighbours in time. The implications were immense. Here was a creature with a brain no larger than that of a chimpanzee, yet it had lived in an environment full of challenges: steep ridges, volcanic terrain, and predators such as Komodo dragons. The Liang Bua skeleton was not an evolutionary accident or a malformed individual. It represented an entire population adapted to island life. But adapted from what? That question would haunt scientists for years to come. Some propose that the Flores, Hobbits, descended from Homo erectus, the same species that had reached Java more than 1 million years earlier, gradually shrinking in size through a process known as island dwarfism. Others saw features that looked even more ancient: the shape of the wrist bones, the flared pelvis, the primitive jaw, and speculated that perhaps this species had branched off before erectus, descending from a more archaic ancestor closer to Homo habilis. Either way, it was clear that human evolution had not followed a simple, linear path. For the archaeologists who first uncovered her, the discovery was both exhilarating and unnerving. In the dim light of their headlamps, they could see an entire human skeleton nearly intact, something almost unheard of in tropical environments where bone decays quickly. Every piece of bone they brushed free told a story: the curve of the skull, the slender ribs, the femur shaped for short strides. It was a body designed not for open savannas, but for dense forests and rocky slopes. Standing in that cave, the researchers were aware that they were looking at a fellow human, yet one so different that it felt like encountering another branch of our own family tree still alive in memory. The scientific community met the announcement with a mix of astonishment and skepticism. When the discovery was published in 2004, headlines around the world declared the finding of a new species of human. Some researchers immediately questioned whether the skeleton might simply be a modern human with a developmental disorder, such as microcephaly. The idea seemed almost too extraordinary. Could a species with such small brains truly have survived into such recent times? But as more skeletons emerged from Liang Bua and the evidence accumulated, this simplest explanation, that this was indeed a distinct species, became harder to dismiss. The fossils were consistent, the proportions unique, and the geological context secure. The little woman from Flores was real, and she was not one of us. What made the discovery even more compelling was its timing in geological history. The layers of ash and sediment in Liang Bua recorded a turbulent environment of volcanic eruptions, changing sea levels, and fluctuating climates. Yet through it all, Homo FLORESIENSIS persisted. The island itself had been isolated by deep ocean channels even during the lower sea levels of the Ice Age, meaning that the ancestors of these small humans had somehow crossed the sea long ago, an act that hinted at intelligence and adaptability we had not credited to early hominins. It suggested that the human capacity for exploration and risk-taking was not unique to our own species, but part of a deeper evolutionary inheritance. For modern science, the Hobbit of Flores became a humbling symbol, a reminder that the human story is far from complete. Each fossil unearthed in that cave chipped away at the comforting illusion of a straightforward lineage. Instead of a ladder leading from ape to man, evolution appeared more like a web, full of branches that diverged, flourished, and vanished, often in isolation. The little woman from Liang Bua showed that some of those branches survived much longer than anyone imagined. If the world could hide an entire human species until just 50,000 years ago, what else might lie buried, waiting to be found? There was also something strangely intimate about this discovery. To look at her skull, rounded but small, with deep-set eyes and a jaw that once formed a smile, is to confront a paradox. She was profoundly different from us in size and form, yet not alien. Her bones speak of upright posture, careful balance, and hands capable of grasping and shaping tools. The archaeologists who held her bones in their glove palms were not just studying anatomy, they were touching a life that once walked, thought, and felt. In the silence of the cave, you can almost imagine her moving through the forest, cautious and aware, following the rhythm of her island's dawns and storms. To this day, there is no recovered DNA from Homo floresiensis. The humid tropical conditions of Indonesia dissolve genetic material quickly, and multiple attempts at extraction have failed. What we know of her species comes entirely from the bones and the stones that surrounded them. That makes every fossil fragment precious. Each ridge, each joint, a clue in the puzzle of who these people were. We may never hear their voices or know their myths, but their existence widens the circle of what it means to be human. And perhaps that is what makes the story of the Flores Hobbits so captivating. They remind us that humanity is not a single form but a spectrum, a long experiment with many outcomes. Our species, Homo sapiens, was not inevitable. We are simply the last surviving branch of a vast varied family. On Flores, nature conducted one of its quiet experiments, shaping small, resilient humans who thrived for hundreds of thousands of years in a world of giants and scarcity. Their story begins, for us, in that moment of discovery in 2003, when a few curious scientists lifted a skull from the earth and realized that they were holding the echo of another kind of us. When the dust settled and the reports were published, the global fascination was immediate. People wanted to see the face of the Hobbit, to imagine her life. Artists reconstructed her from bone to skin, giving her large eyes and a thoughtful expression, as if she were perpetually curious. But beyond the reconstructions and museum displays, her presence stirs something quieter, an awareness that the human family once contained more diversity than we can easily imagine. We were never alone. Even as modern humans spread across continents, the world was home to others like us, thinking, surviving, and fading in their own corners of the earth. Liang Bua remains one of the most evocative archaeological sites in the world, a dark chamber of time that still holds secrets. When you stand at its entrance today, the light from outside cuts into the cool interior, just as it did for the hobbits tens of thousands of years ago. Bats flutter overhead, and the floor bears faint traces of excavation grids. Somewhere in that soil are still unexcavated layers, perhaps containing more clues, or more individuals yet to be found. For now, we can only piece together the fragments of what we have and marvel at the improbable survival of this tiny branch of humanity. Science, in its best form, accepts wonder as part of the process. The story of Homo floresiensis is not a tale of certainty but of humility, of how every new find reminds us of how little we truly know. Each generation of researchers adds a few new lines to the book of human origins, and the chapters are rarely complete. We may never know exactly how these small people lived or why they vanished, but we know that they did exist, and that they changed how we see ourselves. They were real humans in every sense that matters. Tool users, explorers, survivors, and their bones speak across the ages, quietly but unmistakably. The little woman of Flores is not a myth, not a distortion, but a scientific fact that invites philosophical reflection. She stands as evidence that nature's creativity did not stop with us. Somewhere between the ape and the modern mind, evolution paused to try something smaller, lighter, and perhaps more efficient. Whether by necessity or by chance, the result was a lineage that endured in splendid isolation, until our own ancestors arrived on nearby islands. The tragedy and beauty of her discovery lie in the same truth. She survived long enough to be remembered, but not long enough to meet us. And so the cave of Liang Bua, once just another site in the tropics, became a doorway into one of the most unexpected stories of human evolution. The Hobbit woman unearthed there reminds us that science, at its heart, is an act of listening. Listening to the earth, to its silence, to what it still holds. In that silence, a small voice seems to echo. We were here too. If deep time calms you, if you drift with these stories while winding down, driving, or just wondering, consider subscribing, leaving a like, or sharing this episode forward. It helps other sleepless minds find their way back through the dark. Timestamps are below in case you fall asleep mid-story and want to return later. No hurry, the island waits. Now. Let's step into Liang Bua at twilight, where firelight flickers on small hands and the shadows of giants move across the wall. On this shore another version of us once lived, and then was gone. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story. Imagine this. 1,000,000 years before the first sparks of our own species, a small group of ancient humans stood at the edge of an unknown sea. Behind them lay the vast grasslands of Asia, teeming with elephants, saber-toothed cats, and other early hominins. Before them stretched a restless blue horizon, broken by distant shapes of islands blurred by heat and haze. They could not have known it, but those islands would become a laboratory for one of evolution's strangest experiments. Somewhere between courage, accident, and luck, they crossed that water and were never seen again. Yet their descendants would one day astonish science, because the footprints they left behind would not lead back to the mainland. They would lead to Flores. We may never know what pushed those ancient humans toward the sea. Perhaps it was hunger or drought, or the pull of smoke from across the waves. The ancestors of Homo FLORESIENSIS are thought to have belonged to Homo erectus, a species that had already spread far beyond Africa into the open expanses of Asia. Erectus was a pioneer, tall, clever, capable of making fire and crafting hand axes. By the time they reached what we now call Indonesia, they had survived for nearly 1,000,000 years as the dominant human on Earth. But reaching Flores was different. This island lay beyond the Wallace Line, a powerful biogeographical barrier separating Asian and Australasian ecosystems. Even during the lower sea levels of the ice ages, when continents were fused and oceans retreated, the deep channels around Flores never fully dried. To get there, they had to cross water that stretched farther than the eye could see. For decades, scientists assumed such feats were impossible for early humans. Until the discovery of the Flores Hobbits, it was widely believed that deliberate seafaring began only with Homo sapiens. Yet the stone tools scattered across the Soa basin of central Flores tell another story. Buried under volcanic ash and dated to around 1,000,000 years ago, these tools, simple flakes and cores chipped from local rock, reveal that someone, long before us, made landfall there. Whoever they were, they didn't just visit, they stayed. The stone layers stack one atop another across hundreds of thousands of years, evidence of repeated activity. They were not drifters. They were colonists of a new world. How could Homo erectus have made such a crossing? The simplest explanation is accident. Perhaps a small group was caught in a storm while foraging near a river mouth and swept out to sea on a mat of tangled vegetation. Such natural rafts, floating islands of uprooted trees, can drift for weeks, carrying animals and debris across surprisingly long distances. Ocean currents in the region even flow in a pattern that could carry such rafts directly toward Flores. Other scientists propose a more deliberate journey. After all, Homo erectus had mastered fire, planned hunts, and shaped tools with geometric precision. Could they also have learned to lash bamboo or logs together, to cling to buoyant trunks, and to let the waves take them toward visible land on the horizon? The thought alone redefines what primitive means. Once on Flores, the ocean itself became their greatest wall. From that moment onward they were cut off, an entire human lineage sealed within an island world. No great herds to follow, no neighbouring tribes to trade genes with. The same sea that had carried them there now kept them prisoner. Evolution, always opportunistic, began to tinker. With limited resources, new predators, and a compressed ecosystem, these stranded Homo erectus faced a slow but relentless pressure to change. Over hundreds of millennia, their bodies, their behaviours, and perhaps even their minds, began to diverge from their mainland ancestors. They would become smaller, lighter, and more specialised. A process invisible to them, yet written in every generation that followed. It's easy to romanticise this crossing as a heroic odyssey, but for the first settlers of Flores, it was probably a quiet disaster. Imagine the first dawn after their arrival, the waves receding, the forest stretching before them with unfamiliar sounds, the air thick with humidity, the trees crowded with strange calls. The island offered food but demanded caution. Without large predators like tigers, new threats took other forms: venomous snakes, massive reptiles, unpredictable weather. But these early humans were adaptable. Homo erectus had already proven capable of surviving from the cold steppes of China to the heat of Java. On Flores, adaptation would take on a new dimension, one shaped by scarcity and solitude rather than conquest. In the Soa Basin, stone tools lie alongside fossils of the island's ancient fauna: dwarf elephants known as Stegodon florensis, giant storks, and monitor lizards that could grow longer than a man. These finds confirm that humans were present on Flores at least 800,000 years ago, and likely much earlier. What began as a single accidental arrival may have led to generations of island-born descendants, their children growing up never knowing another world beyond the mountains and coasts of Flores. Over time, isolation became identity. Their world was smaller, but perhaps more stable. The rhythm of tides and monsoon rains would have dictated their movements. Every tree, every stream, every trail through the volcanic soil would have been familiar. To understand what that meant, picture evolution not as a ladder, but as a tide. On the mainland, Homo erectus continued to evolve, moving toward the large-brained populations that would one day give rise to us. But on Flores, cut off by ocean and time, that tide never reached. There, a smaller wave of humanity lingered, shaped not by progress but by the physics of isolation. The humans of Flores became smaller because they could, because in a world with limited food, smaller bodies meant longer survival. While this transformation will be explored later, its seed was planted here, in this moment of marooning. The very act of being stranded began a new evolutionary story. There is something almost mythic about this image. A few hominins swept across an ocean they could not comprehend, landing on a green volcanic island that would one day be their tomb and our mystery. And yet, beneath the wonder, the story remains resolutely scientific. The tools in the Soa Basin are real. The sediments have been dated by multiple independent teams using modern radiometric techniques. Every line of evidence points to early humans reaching Flores around 1 million years ago. No other known primate ever accomplished that until much later. These pioneers were, in a sense, the first accidental sailors in Earth's history. The Flores crossing forces us to reconsider what intelligence and adaptability meant in deep time. Navigation does not require charts or compasses. Sometimes it requires only curiosity and persistence. Homo erectus may not have known where the horizon ended, but they knew how to follow opportunity. Once on Flores, their survival depended on learning a new rhythm, how to hunt smaller prey, how to find water in volcanic soil, how to endure tropical storms. Over countless generations, these habits became instinct, and instinct became evolution's sculptor. When we look at the map of the Indonesian archipelago today, it's hard to grasp how dynamic it once was. During the Ice Ages, when sea levels dropped by more than 100 metres, large islands like Borneo and Java fused into a single landmass called Sunda. To the east, another giant shelf called Sahul linked New Guinea to Australia. But between these two worlds lay a chain of deep-sea islands, Sulawesi, Lombok, Sumbawa, Flores, Timor, each separated by permanent water. This was Wallacea, a place of transition and wonder, where Asia's tigers and elephants gave way to Australia's marsupials and birds of paradise. The Wallace Line, which runs between Bali and Lombok, marks a division not just of species but of possibility. Everything east of that line remained biologically distinct for millions of years. For Homo erectus to cross, it was equivalent to crossing a wall built by evolution itself. What might have driven them to try? Perhaps the smell of smoke on the wind, or the sight of clouds towering over an unseen island suggesting land beyond the sea. Early humans had eyes tuned to landscapes, able to spot distant silhouettes and read patterns in currents. They were opportunists, explorers by necessity. And so, whether by accident or intent, they found themselves on Flores, a fragment of land that would isolate them for nearly 1 million years. From that moment forward, the lineage that would become Homo FLORESIENSIS began to evolve apart. While their mainland cousins continued to grow taller and smarter, the islanders followed another path, one defined by constraint rather than expansion. They became specialists in survival, sculpted by limits rather than abundance. For them, the horizon was not a frontier to cross again, but a boundary to live within. As a scientist, or simply as a curious observer of our species' story, one cannot help but feel humility here. We often think of human history as a record of progress, of expansion, mastery and control over nature. But the story of Flores reminds us that evolution also thrives in confinement, that creativity and endurance can emerge from restriction as much as from freedom. The ancestors of the Hobbits did not conquer their island, they adapted to it. And in doing so, they revealed a truth that still echoes through biology. Life does not seek perfection, only persistence. What began as a crossing of chance became one of the most remarkable examples of evolutionary isolation in the human record. Long before modern humans dreamed of boats or maps, our distant kin had already reached a place we once thought unreachable. The waves that carried them there also erased their way home, and as the centuries rolled into millennia, their descendants slowly changed, leaving behind the shape of Homo erectus and moving towards something entirely new. A small-bodied, small-brained human perfectly tuned to its island. When we step back and trace this journey, from the mainland of Asia to the jungles of Flores, it feels almost like a parable written by the earth itself, a story about chance, adaptation, and the invisible hand of time. A story that reminds us that isolation does not end life. Sometimes it reinvents it. Imagine stepping ashore on an island where the natural order seems to have been rewritten by dreams. The forest hum with strange life, but the scale of everything feels slightly off, as if someone had reached into the world and quietly adjusted the proportions. In the shallows, a herd of elephants passes, yet each one is barely the height of your shoulder. The ground trembles, but not from their weight, from something else, slower and heavier, moving through the undergrowth. A lizard, armoured and glistening, longer than a man is tall, its tongue flicking like a whisper of ancient heat. Above, the shadow of wings drifts over the canopy, a stalk taller than any living human, stalking the edges of marsh and forest. This is not a fantasy world. This was Flores, roughly 800,000 years ago, an island where evolution's rules had bent themselves into something wonderfully strange. For those first humans marooned here, it must have felt like walking into another version of Earth, one that played by its own laws. Flores sat deep in the Wallacean archipelago, isolated by deep channels that no ice age could bridge. Cut off for millions of years, its ecosystem evolved like a sealed experiment. The large became small, and the small grew large. Biologists call this phenomenon the island rule, an evolutionary pattern seen around the world, but expressed on Flores with particular flair. Limited resources, absence of big predators, and tight ecological niches forced every creature to adapt in ways that seem upside down to mainland logic. On Flores, the struggle for existence favoured efficiency over size, endurance over dominance. The clearest symbol of this inversion was the dwarf elephant known as Stegodon florensis insularis. Its mainland relatives had been massive, tusked herbivores weighing several tons, but the Flores version stood scarcely as tall as a modern cow. Fossils show that these miniature elephants grazed in small herds, their feet leaving delicate circular prints across volcanic ash beds now turned to stone. To survive on limited vegetation, their bodies shrank generation by generation, conserving energy in a land where forests were patchy and dry seasons long. For the humans who would one day walk among them, these little elephants were both a food source and a lesson, a demonstration of how isolation reshapes life itself. But Flores did not belong only to herbivores. Sharing the island was one of Earth's great survivors, the Komodo dragon, Varanus komodoensis. The dragons of Flores were cousins to those still alive today, apex predators with serrated teeth and patient tempers. They could reach 3 meters in length, capable of felling prey many times their size. On Flores they ruled the food chain unchallenged, taking down dwarf elephants, scavenging carcasses, and occasionally feasting on anything else that wandered too close. To a stranded population of early humans, these dragons must have been both threat and constant companion, a reminder that even in a place with no lions or tigers, there was always something larger waiting in the shadows. Then there were the storks, Leptoptylos robustus, enormous birds that towered at nearly 2 meters tall. Fossils from Liang Bua Cave show bones of wings and legs so large that at first they were mistaken for an extinct relative of a marabou stork from Africa. But this was a native giant, evolved on Flores to dominate the skies in a world without competition from big cats or eagles. With wings wide as a doorway and a heavy bill designed to pierce flesh, these birds likely fed on small animals, carrion, and perhaps even unwary newborn stegodon. One can imagine their haunting silhouettes circling above open clearings at dusk, scanning for movement, their presence both majestic and ominous. And beneath the stork's stalking feet scurried another island oddity, the Flores giant rat, Papagomis armonvillei, as large as a rabbit and perfectly adapted to the ecological vacuum. In the absence of true large mammals, rodents filled every niche. Some species became oversized seed-eaters, others agile climbers or burrowers. For early humans, these rats may have been a staple meal, providing precious protein when larger prey proved elusive. Fossil evidence shows a mosaic of rodent sizes, a microcosm of evolution running in fast forward, responding to the pressures of confinement. This was the Flores ecosystem during the Middle Pleistocene, an assembly of giants and dwarfs, predators and opportunists, all balanced within a fragile web. The absence of large mainland predators meant that many animals lost their instinctive fear of humans. Yet food scarcity, unpredictable climate cycles, and periodic volcanic eruptions kept life precarious. It was a system always on the edge, dynamic, self-contained, and vulnerable. And within it, the stranded descendants of Homo erectus found themselves as both participants and intruders. To appreciate what happened next, it helps to imagine Flores not as a tropical paradise, but as an island laboratory. In small populations cut off from the outside world, genetic variation is limited. Random mutations and selection pressures take on exaggerated effects. Over hundreds of thousands of years, evolution works like a sculptor confined to a single block of stone, carving efficiency where abundance once allowed excess. Large animals like Stegodon became smaller because smaller bodies required less food. Birds and reptiles grew larger because there was little competition to limit them. Every species adapted toward a balance point, the minimum energy cost for survival, and the humans trapped there were no exception. What began as a handful of Homo erectus individuals, tall, robust, and used to roam in wide landscapes, would over the course of millennia begin to shrink. Not immediately, not consciously, but subtly, generation by generation, as those better suited to scarcity survived more easily. In a closed system, size becomes a liability. The large die first when food grows scarce. The small endure. In this sense, Flores was not just an island. It was an evolutionary filter. Everything that could not adapt to its scale eventually disappeared. The island's environment itself encouraged such adaptation. Much of Flores was covered in a mosaic of grasslands and monsoon forests, punctuated by volcanic ridges. The climate oscillated between wet and dry, sometimes lush and other times harsh. Freshwater streams carved through limestone valleys, and the air buzzed with insects year-round. The soil was volcanic but not always fertile, and plant life, though diverse, offered only limited calories for large herbivores. Life on Flores demanded economy, not in money, but in metabolism. It favoured creatures that could make more from less. Even without knowing it, the ancestors of Homo FLORESIENSIS were being reshaped by this principle. Cut off from new genetic influx, their evolution followed its own rhythm. This is the quiet miracle of islands. They turn time inward. Each generation's adaptation builds upon the last in ways the mainland would erase through interbreeding or migration. On Flores, the genetic drift was magnified, the experiment uninterrupted, and so the animals became caricatures of themselves, exaggerated forms sculpted by scarcity. Scientists who study island biogeography have long marvelled at this pattern. The same logic that produced miniature elephants and giant lizards on Flores also created pygmy hippos on Madagascar and massive flightless birds on New Zealand. Islands, by isolating species from the stabilizing chaos of continents, expose the raw mechanics of natural selection. There are no half measures. There is only survival within constraint. Flores, with its deep-sea boundaries and relentless isolation, was one of the purest examples of this phenomenon on Earth. What makes Flores exceptional, however, is that humans were part of that system. Nowhere else in the fossil record do we see a human lineage subjected so completely to the island rule. The evidence suggests that our distant cousins lived alongside this inverted ecosystem for hundreds of millennia, adapting as naturally as the Stegodon or the Komodo dragons. And in that isolation, they changed. They became smaller, lighter, and more suited to the island's rhythms, though the details of that transformation belong to the next part of this story. For now, we linger in the image of this Pleistocene Eden of misfit giants and miniature titans. A world where the roar of big cats was replaced by the hiss of reptiles, where the thunder of elephants was a soft shuffle of pygmy feet. The air would have been thick with heat and the sound of insects, the forest floor alive with a scurry of overgrown rats. Near the rivers, herds of small stegodon browsed on low trees, their tiny tusks gleaming in sunlight filtered through mist. Komodo dragons lurked in ambush among fallen logs, their scales blending with the dry leaves, and circling above, the great stalks traced shadows across the canopy, indifferent to the small creatures below. In such a world, size meant nothing. Power belonged to the adaptable, the efficient, the patient. This inversion of nature's hierarchy would define the destiny of Flores and its inhabitants for the next several 100,000 years. It was here, amid these giants and dwarfs, that humanity was reimagined, not as conqueror, but as participant, moulded by the same forces that shaped every other creature on the island. We do not know whether those early humans understood the uniqueness of their world, or whether they noticed the strange symmetry between themselves and the island's other inhabitants. But the fossils suggest coexistence, not dominance, a long balance between predator and prey, scarcity and survival. And perhaps if we could stand beside them at dusk, watching the last light fall across the forest, and the dragons move through shadow, we might recognize something familiar. The quiet negotiation between life and limitation that defines every species, including our own. In the end, Flores teaches us that evolution is not a story of conquest, but of adaptation. The island rule is not magic, only mathematics, the arithmetic of survival on a finite stage. But within that arithmetic lies poetry. Elephants as small as calves, lizards as large as crocodiles, birds that tower like ghosts above the canopy, and humans who would one day shrink to fit the rhythm of this inverted paradise. On Flores, nature played its strangest symphony, and from it emerged one of the most extraordinary chapters in the human story. Imagine finding a skeleton so small you could cradle its skull in your hands, yet so ancient that it carries whispers from 1,000,000 years ago. In the dim light of Liang Bua Cave, this is exactly what scientists saw. A tiny body frozen in time, its bones telling two conflicting stories at once. One spoke of humanity, upright posture, stone tools nearby, signs of adaptation. The other spoke of something far older, almost ancestral, proportions that didn't belong to any known human of the last 500,000 years. It was as if nature had pressed pause on one lineage, while the rest of humanity had moved on. The skeleton, catalogued as Liang Bua 1, belonged to an adult female who had lived sometime between 100,000 and 60,000 years ago. She stood only about 1 metre tall, weighing roughly 25 kilograms, no taller than a child, but unmistakably adult. Her skull had fully erupted wisdom teeth, a mature jawbone, and the fused sutures that mark the end of growth. Whatever this creature was, it was no juvenile, no stunted individual. Her proportions had been fixed by generations of evolution, sculpted to fit the peculiar demands of an island world. At first glance, the skull looked almost familiar. The curve of the forehead, the general symmetry of the face. There was something human about it. But then the details began to emerge, and with them, confusion. The skull's brow ridges were heavy and pronounced, like those of Homo erectus. The cranial vault was low, sloping back into a narrow dome rather than the high, rounded shape seen in modern humans, and the brain cavity, when measured, yielded a volume of just over 400 cubic centimetres, about a third of ours, closer in size to that of a chimpanzee, or the much older Australopithecines from Africa. The brain was tiny, yet the stone tools in nearby layers implied behaviours that demanded coordination, memory and planning. How could such a small brain produce such sophistication? That question would linger for decades. The body beneath that skull only deepened the mystery. The pelvis was broad and flared, recalling early human ancestors from 2 million years before. The femur and tibia were short but thick, built for endurance rather than speed. The shoulders rotated forward in a way that allowed greater flexibility for climbing, a feature rare among later humans but common in our more primitive kin. The arms were proportionally long compared to the legs, giving the figure a slightly ape-like silhouette when reconstructed. Yet the bones themselves were refined and symmetrical, the mark of a species long adapted to bipedal walking. These were not half-evolved creatures. They were a different solution to the same evolutionary problem. Perhaps the most striking feature of all was the feet. They were enormous in proportion to the rest of the body, nearly as long as the femur. The toes were broad and slightly curved, and the overall structure suggested a stride both human and not. Walking on such feet would have been slower, less efficient, but remarkably stable. On uneven volcanic terrain, in forests full of roots and rocks, that stability could have been an advantage. The ankle bones hinted at a gait more deliberate than ours, a slow, rolling step that left long footprints but little noise. Some scientists compared it to the way a toddler walks, careful, balanced, with a slightly awkward rhythm. But there was nothing clumsy about it. This was an anatomy tuned precisely to its environment. Even the wrists added to the enigma. The wrist bones of Homo floresiensis retained a primitive architecture unseen in other humans since Homo habilis, a species that lived more than 1.5 million years earlier. The shape of the trapezoid and scaphoid bones suggested limited rotation, better suited to gripping branches than performing fine manipulation. Yet nearby artifacts, sharp flakes, cutting tools, proved that these hands could still carve and cut. The combination was baffling. Primitive form, advanced function. A reminder that evolution doesn't build new blueprints, it reuses old ones in unexpected ways. The face of the Hobbit, when reconstructed, looked unlike anything alive today. The skull's jaw was deep and heavy, the chin absent. The nose was flat and broad, the teeth small but worn, evidence of an omnivorous diet. The eyes, based on the orbits, would have been large relative to the skull, perhaps giving the living individual a wide, alert expression. Despite its small brain, the shape of the frontal bone suggested space for expanded temporal lobes, regions associated with memory and planning. In that sense, Homo floresiensis may have balanced its small size with neural efficiency, compressing capability into a compact frame. Each new detail forced scientists to reconsider what it meant to be human. The Liang Bua skeleton combined features from species that had never been seen together before. Its jaw and teeth looked like a scaled-down Homo erectus, but its shoulders and wrists reached even farther back in time. It was as if someone had taken a body from the early Pleistocene and miniaturized it for island life. The evolutionary mosaic was so strange that many researchers initially refused to accept it as a distinct species. Some proposed it was a modern human with a growth disorder, perhaps microcephaly. Others argued it could be a case of cretinism caused by iodine deficiency. But as more remains were excavated, more skull fragments, more limb bones, the pattern held. These traits were consistent, not pathological. The Flores skeleton was no anomaly. It was a window into an evolutionary side path that had endured long after the rest of its relatives had vanished. The anatomy also suggested something profound about the tempo of evolution. If these beings truly descended from Homo erectus, then their transformation into such small, archaic forms must have occurred rapidly in geological terms, within less than 1 million years. Island isolation had frozen and sculpted them simultaneously, stripping away traits unnecessary for survival while preserving ancestral ones that worked. In the slow rhythm of evolutionary time, Flores had created its own time capsule, a living fossil lineage surviving in parallel with our own. Examining the bones today, one can sense both continuity and loss. The pelvis and spine show a confident biped, upright and balanced, yet the overall stature speaks of constraint. The skull's thick vault echoes strength, but its low dome whispers vulnerability. The teeth are small and efficient, but the jaw is ancient in shape, a holdover from a deeper chapter of our story. There's a poetry in this anatomy, a physical record of what happens when isolation and scarcity write their own version of humanity. If we could have seen her alive, this little woman of Flores, she might have seemed childlike from afar, but her movements would betray long experience. Her arms would swing slightly wide, her steps quiet and deliberate. Her face, broad and calm, would turn with quick curiosity. She was human enough to remind us of ourselves, but different enough to unsettle that recognition. For a long time, scientists didn't know where to place her on the tree of life. The bones refused to fit any neat category. They seemed to belong both at the beginning and near the end of human evolution, a contradiction only an island could produce. The Liang Bua skeleton also preserves hints of resilience. The leg bones show signs of healed stress, tiny fractures that had repaired themselves, suggesting longevity and endurance. The ribs curve outward, providing ample space for strong lungs, perhaps an adaptation for long walks through humid valleys or climbing steep volcanic ridges. The joints, though small, are reinforced, as if made to bear repeated strain. This was not a fragile creature. Despite its diminutive frame, it carried the strength of survival. Every measurement, every 3D scan, and every comparison with other species has revealed the same paradox. Homo FLORESIENSIS looks primitive, but it lived astonishingly late. Its bones are a living contradiction to the story we once told ourselves, that the primitive must always give way to the modern, that smallness is a sign of inferiority. Yet here, in the middle of the late Pleistocene, walked a being shaped like an echo from the dawn of humankind. When scientists study the skull today, held carefully in climate-controlled labs, they often remark on its compact beauty. The surface bears fine cracks, but the structure remains intact, as if it had waited patiently for this rediscovery. It is perhaps the most eloquent fossil of the last half-century, not because of its age, but because of its defiance. It reminds us that evolution is not progress, it is persistence. Standing in front of her reconstructed figure in a museum today, one feels both closeness and distance. The smooth brow, the wide eyes, the small, sturdy frame, they speak to something intimate, a reminder that humanity once wore many shapes. She's proof that our story is not linear but branching, filled with experiments that flourished briefly before fading. In her, we see the possibility that there were many ways to be human, and that ours is simply the one that endured. Flores's little woman remains one of the most scientifically valuable skeletons ever found, and one of the most haunting. Her anatomy challenges our definitions, her smallness challenges our pride, and her survival challenges our assumptions about what intelligence or progress really mean. Perhaps that is why she endures in the imagination, because her bones, though tiny, hold a question larger than any fossil has ever asked. What if I told you that one of the most surprising minds in our species' family tree fit comfortably inside your hand? In the quiet darkness of Liang Bua, scientists lifted a skull no larger than a grapefruit and realized it had once held a consciousness capable of shaping tools, hunting prey, and enduring isolation for tens of thousands of years. The brain of Homo floresiensis was only about 420 cubic centimeters, scarcely 1/3 the size of a modern human's. Yet this tiny organ powered survival in a world of predators, volcanoes, and scarcity. It was a reminder that intelligence is not a contest of volume, but of design. When the first CT scans of the Liang Bua skull were made, the results puzzled everyone. By all logic, a brain this small should have belonged to a creature closer to an early Australopithecus, a being from over 3 million years ago that could barely control fire or plan beyond the next meal. And yet, the bones surrounding this small brain were only 60,000 years old, dating to a time when our own species was already painting caves and walking the edges of continents. The scientist had to ask, how could such a small brain achieve so much so recently? The first step to answering that question came from the brain's shape. Although the skull was small, its internal structure, studied through digital endocasts or three-dimensional reconstructions of the inner cavity, revealed something unexpected. The frontal lobes, responsible for planning and problem-solving, were well developed. The temporal lobes, tied to memory and social understanding, showed complex folding patterns more similar to modern humans than to any known ape or ancient ancestor. In other words, Homo floresiensis didn't just have a small brain, it had a compact, efficient one. Like the difference between an old, bulky computer and a modern microchip, it seemed the architecture mattered more than the size. Dean Falk, a neuroanthropologist who studied the skull in detail, compared its shape to those of Homo erectus, modern humans, and even individuals with microcephaly, a condition that dramatically reduces brain size. The Flores skull did not fit any pathological model. Its shape was deliberate, not deformed. The asymmetry of the brain, the expanded prefrontal region, and the orientation of the cerebellum all pointed to a naturally evolved species, not a diseased version of ourselves. This was not a shrunken human brain. It was a small brain built differently. That discovery forced a reconsideration of what brain size means. For over a century, scientists had treated cranial capacity as a proxy for intelligence. Bigger brain, higher cognition. But the Hobbits of Flores undermined that rule as thoroughly as corvids, dolphins, or octopuses do today. These small-brained beings were producing stoneflakes with precision, cutting meat from carcasses, and navigating their island's challenges in ways that demanded awareness, memory, and planning. Clearly, they were doing more with less. Part of the answer may lie in brain organization, how the neurons are wired, not how many there are. The endocast of Homo floresiensis showed a pattern of folding that indicated dense cortical packing. In smaller brains, neurons may be more tightly arranged, reducing communication distances between regions. That means information can travel faster even with fewer cells. The Hobbits' brains might have been optimized for efficiency, a miniature architecture designed by necessity. Isolation can do that to a species, force it to refine rather than expand. The brain's proportions also reveal another intriguing detail. While the overall size was tiny, the relative areas associated with higher cognition were disproportionately large. The frontal and temporal lobes were expanded, suggesting strong capacities for planning and possibly for symbolic thought. This doesn't mean they painted walls or sang songs. We have no evidence for that. But it does mean they could imagine a task, hold an image of it in their mind and execute it, the foundation of technology and cooperation. When you look at the endocast of LB1, it's easy to forget that this skull once contained something living, a consciousness negotiating the hazards of an island. Perhaps that brain remembered the sound of rain in the cave, the shape of safe paths through volcanic ridges, or the scent of fruiting trees. Its neurons fired with the same electrical impulses that power ours, though arranged differently, tuned to the rhythm of its smaller body. In that way, it reminds us that cognition is not simply scale, it's adaptation. Even in our own species, brain size alone doesn't predict intelligence. Some modern humans have brain volumes smaller than the average Neanderthal but show no cognitive deficit. The relationship between size and capability is nonlinear, modulated by how regions interconnect. It's possible that Homo FLORESIENSIS evolved a brain specialized for its limited environment, one that focused on immediate survival, spatial awareness, and social cohesion, without the metabolic cost of supporting unnecessary cognitive load. Smaller bodies require fewer calories, and smaller brains, if efficiently structured, can perform remarkably well within those limits. What the Liang Bua skull tells us then is that nature is pragmatic. It doesn't build for prestige, it builds for function. In the tight feedback loop of island evolution, waste is punished and efficiency rewarded. If a species can solve its problems with a smaller brain, evolution will not insist on a larger one. On Flores, intelligence may have been measured not in abstract reasoning, but in precision. The quiet genius of knowing when to hunt, when to hide, and how to endure the rhythms of isolation. There's an old assumption that evolution is a march toward complexity, that larger brains represent progress. But Homo floresiensis exposes the vanity of that belief. Intelligence can take many shapes, and sometimes the smallest ones are the most surprising. Modern birds with brains smaller than a walnut can solve multi-step puzzles. Tiny primates memorize routes through dense forests. The Hobbits of Flores lived in a landscape that demanded ingenuity rather than imagination. They didn't need to dream of the stars. They needed to survive the next storm, the next hunt, the next generation. For that, their brains were perfectly sufficient. One scientist once joked, with affection, that having a small head on Flores didn't stop them from big achievements. And it's true. These beings had adapted their cognition to an island scale, where every resource was finite and every choice mattered. Their intelligence was local, contextual, and enduring. We often define genius by invention or conquest, but perhaps real intelligence is simpler, to live well within the boundaries of one's world. When researchers digitally reconstructed the inner surface of the LB1 skull, they noticed something else, traces of a strong asymmetry, meaning one side of the brain was slightly larger. In humans, such asymmetry often reflects lateralization, specialization between hemispheres for language, spatial reasoning, and fine motor control. It's speculative, but that structural hint suggests the Hobbits might have shared some neurological foundations with us. They may have communicated through simple vocal calls, coordinated group movements, or remembered locations through shared gestures. Even without words, there are many ways to think together. What we see in Homo floresiensis is a reminder that the brain is not a symbol of superiority, but a survival tool. It evolves to fit its environment as precisely as a bird's wing or a fish's fin. On Flores, that environment was constrained. Food was limited, dangers local, horizons close. The island didn't demand philosophers, it demanded survivors. The Hobbits' brains were small, but every millimetre of cortex earned its keep. And yet, there's a deeper wonder here. While their bodies were miniaturized, their story magnifies ours. For most of our evolutionary history, we've equated intelligence with scale, with the swelling of the frontal cortex, the explosion of symbolic behaviour, the march towards civilization. The Hobbits quietly suggest another possibility, that consciousness itself might not be tied to size at all, but to structure and need. That, somewhere, 60,000 years ago, In the half-dark of a tropical cave, a brain no larger than a grapefruit was making plans, recognizing patterns, and surviving against odds. We don't know what they thought, or if they wondered as we do. But the fossilized curve of that skull is enough to ask, what does it mean to be clever? Is it invention or endurance? Is it art or adaptation? The Hobbits of Flores may have answered long before us without words, through a life lived entirely within the means of a miniature brain. And perhaps that is the quiet brilliance of their kind. Intelligence not measured in volume, but in understanding exactly enough to live. Imagine this. Deep in the dim belly of Liang Bua Cave, a scientist brushes aside a layer of ancient dust and finds a blade small enough to fit on a child's fingertip. The edges are sharp, finely chipped, each flake struck with precision. Scattered around it are hundreds of similar tools, points, scrapers, microblades, all perfectly proportioned for the hands of the small humans who once lived here. These are not crude stones broken by chance. They are deliberate, consistent, and efficient. Whoever made them knew how stone behaves when struck, how to split it cleanly, how to turn an ordinary rock into a survival tool. On an island without metal, without large prey, and without outside contact, Homo FLORESIENSIS left behind a record of mastery etched into stone. The most remarkable thing about these tools is not their size, but their sophistication. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of them, layered in sediment spanning nearly 150,000 years of continuous use, from as early as 190,000 years ago down to about 50,000 years ago, when the species likely disappeared. Across those long millennia, the craftsmanship hardly changed. It was as if the tradition was already perfected long before the Hobbits of Flores appeared, inherited from their ancestors, and simply refined to suit smaller hands. The continuity of design speaks of knowledge, not instinct, not accident, but cultural transmission. Each generation must have watched the previous one chip stone and learned the rhythm of flaking, the delicate geometry of percussion. On an island locked in time, this tradition became their inheritance, their language of survival. To a casual observer, the tools might seem primitive, unpolished flakes of volcanic rock. But under a magnifying lens, the patterns tell another story. The edges show controlled pressure flaking, the unmistakable sign of deliberate shaping. Some pieces were clearly hafted, attached to wooden shafts to form cutting tools or spear tips. Others were designed for scraping hides, carving wood, or slicing through plant fibres. The so-called microblades were particularly fine, almost surgical in precision. They could have been used to butcher small prey or process fibrous plants into cordage. These are not the tools of a brute, they are the tools of a mind that understood function. The materials themselves reveal ingenuity. The Hobbits used local volcanic stones, mostly chert and quartzite, gathered from nearby riverbeds. These rocks fractured predictably, allowing the maker to anticipate the shape of the flake before striking. In many ways, the technology mirrors that of Homo erectus found in Java, the likely ancestors of Homo FLORESIENSIS. But while erectus produced large hand axes and cleavers, the Flores hominins miniaturized their toolkit to match their scale. This wasn't a downgrade, it was optimization. A smaller body could carry more tools, less weight meant more mobility, and on an island where survival depended on agility rather than brute strength, that mattered. Some of the earliest evidence of stone tool use on Flores comes not from Liang Bua, but from the Soa Basin in the island's heart. There, in sediments dated to around 800,000 years ago, archaeologists found simple flakes and cores lying beside the fossilized bones of dwarf stegodon and giant Komodo dragons. Even then, before Homo floresiensis had evolved, their ancestors were already using tools to butcher meat, and perhaps defend themselves against predators. The continuity between those ancient artifacts and the ones found later in Liang Bua suggests an unbroken lineage of craftsmanship, stretching across hundreds of thousands of years. On this remote island, technology didn't just survive, it persisted, untouched by outside influence, a self-contained tradition in stone. What's striking is that this technology never degraded into randomness. It maintained complexity despite the small population size. Normally, isolation leads to the loss of cultural skills. Fewer people mean fewer teachers, fewer innovations, and eventually cultural drift. Yet on Flores, the opposite seems to have happened. The tools remained consistent, functional, and efficient. It's as if simplicity itself became their sophistication. Perhaps on a small island, stability was more valuable than innovation. When you live in a finite world, the smartest thing you can do is keep what works. Modern experiments in lithic replication have shown that making these tools requires dexterity and foresight. A single mistake in angle or pressure ruins the flake. Even with modern hands, achieving the fine edges of Flores-style microblades takes skill. The idea that a hominin with a brain 1/3 our size could produce such artifacts forces us to rethink what intelligence looks like. Perhaps they didn't need imagination as we define it. They needed precision, patience, and collective memory. In the echoing light of Liang Bua, tool-making may have been as much ritual as necessity, a familiar rhythm that connected generations. Some of the artifacts also show signs of reworking, edges resharpened after use, points reflaked to extend their lifespan. That economy hints at a deep understanding of material limits. Stone was abundant, but time and energy were not. Every tool represented effort, and on an island where survival was a constant negotiation with scarcity, efficiency was intelligence. Even their choice of tool size suggests deliberate adaptation. The Hobbits made tools small enough to handle comfortably with their short fingers, but not so small as to lose effectiveness. It's tempting to imagine one of them seated cross-legged on the ground, striking flakes from a pebble held between calloused hands, sparks flying briefly in the half-dark of a cave. Each chip, each tap, each rhythm of contact, a quiet conversation between human and stone. The consistency of the tool layers at Liang Bua tells another subtle story. Archaeologists note that the artifacts appear in distinct clusters, pockets of activity separated by layers of ash and sediment. This suggests repeated occupation of the cave over many tens of thousands of years. The Hobbits may have returned seasonally or cyclically, bringing with them the same methods, the same stone preferences, the same patterns of use. In other words, they remembered, not just individually, but collectively. And while their toolkit lacked the artistic flourishes that would later appear in modern human cultures, it was nonetheless a reflection of intelligence scaled to purpose. The tools did what they needed to do. Nothing more, nothing less. That restraint is itself a kind of wisdom. It's easy to imagine that as long as these tools kept their edges and the users kept their rhythm, life on Flores continued much as it always had. There's also a quiet humour buried in these discoveries. One researcher, after cataloguing hundreds of tiny flakes, remarked that the Hobbits managed not to cut themselves while making razor-sharp blades, which is more than we can say for some graduate students. It's a gentle reminder that intelligence doesn't always announce itself in grandeur. Sometimes it's the steady hand, the practiced repetition, the ability to solve the same problem correctly 1,000 times in a row. The survival skills implied by these tools extend beyond craftsmanship. The presence of cut marks on animal bones shows that Homo FLORESIENSIS processed meat and likely scavenged or hunted small animals. But even without diving into diet, the very existence of such precise implements tells us they planned. To make a tool, you need to imagine its use before you strike the stone. You must hold the future in your mind, even if only for a few moments. That mental leap, from raw material to purpose, is one of the defining traits of humanity. It's humbling to realize that on this small island, tens of thousands of years before the first city, before agriculture, before writing, there existed a lineage of humans with hands as skilled as any craftsman's and minds quiet enough to focus on the edge of a blade. They didn't build monuments or leave art, but they left proof of thought, the universal human habit of shaping the world through touch. When scientists run their fingers along the edges of these microblades today, they can almost feel the rhythm of those ancient strikes. The distance in time collapses. The stone that once drew blood or sliced meat now rests under museum glass, a silent testament to endurance. Homo floresiensis reminds us that technology doesn't require vast civilizations or towering intellects. Sometimes it arises from necessity and persists through memory. Each flake of stone from Liang Bua carries that quiet legacy, evidence that intelligence can thrive even in miniature, that evolution's smallest experiments can yield the most lasting impressions. On Flores, the mind of a tiny human learned to break stone, and in doing so carved its species a place in the story of survival. Imagine this: twilight seeping into the limestone mouth of Liang Bua Cave, the golden light of day dissolving into grey. The air is damp, alive with the low drone of insects and the faint metallic scent of wet earth. A family of Homo floresiensis settles into their nightly rhythm. The smallest child, barely half the height of a modern toddler, presses against the warmth of an adult's side. The adults, 3, maybe 4 of them, sit in a circle near a cluster of stone flakes scattered across the floor, their edges catching what little light remains. A faint column of smoke coils upward from a pit of darkened ash. Whether it comes from a fire they've tamed or one they've merely borrowed from nature, we can't be sure. But the smell of char and the soft glow against the walls suggest they understood something of flame, enough to feel its comfort, if not to control it fully. Outside, the forest hums with the layered voices of night. Giant fruit bats the size of eagles drift above the canopy, wings whispering through the dusk. A Leptoptelos robustus, the enormous stork that once ruled these skies, lands heavily on a distant branch, its bill clacking in irritation. From the underbrush below, the measured scrape of claws against stone announces something far less harmless. A Komodo dragon, slow and patient, moving through the shadows. The Hobbits know that sound. They've heard it since birth, the low shuffle of a predator that outlasted time. One of the adults glances toward the cave entrance and freezes, listening. The group stills for a moment, then returns to quiet tasks. Even in the Pleistocene, vigilance was survival. Within the cave, the light dims further. The last rays of the sun touch the far wall where ochre-coloured limestone glows briefly, like the inside of a lantern. The floor tells the story of many nights like this one. Layers of ash, cracked bones, stone chips, and fragments of animal teeth. Archaeologists found these remains thousands of years later, but tonight they're still fresh, tangible, part of a living rhythm. A giant rat carcass, skewered on a branch, turns slowly over embers that might once have been sparked from friction or stolen from lightning-struck trees. The smell of roasted meat mingles with the scent of damp stone. The mother uses a small stone flake to pry apart sinew, offering bits to the child who chews clumsily, eyes wide at every noise beyond the cave. A male figure, or perhaps an older female, it's hard to tell in this dim light, sits cross-legged nearby, chipping a pebble into a blade, the rhythmic tink-tink echoing softly. Each strike is deliberate. Each flake that falls adds to a growing pile. These tools are smaller than a human hand, but sharper than they appear. The stone reflects the flickering light, as if holding a memory of sunlight from earlier in the day. Beyond the mouth of the cave, the forest opens into rolling grassland. The last Stegodon herds, dwarf relatives of elephants no taller than a pony, graze in the distance, silhouettes moving like ghosts in the dusk. When they trumpet, it is a deep, resonant sound that rolls through the valley, a reminder that even giants have learned to shrink here. The hobbits don't hunt the adults. They may take a calf if fortune allows, or scavenge what predators leave behind. But mostly, they live in a quiet partnership with this island, taking what it gives and retreating when it turns hostile. As night deepens, the forest grows louder. Crickets vibrate the air. The wind moves through the fig trees, carrying the faint calls of night birds. A scuffle near the cave's edge sends a shiver through the group. A Komodo, perhaps, testing its luck. The adults shift closer together. They don't speak as we do, but their gestures are precise, practiced. A hand pressed to the shoulder means silence. A glance toward the wall means stay. Communication in its purest form, efficient, instinctive, built from years of shared danger. The youngest ones know the routine. They curl up against the elders, nestling into the furs and leaves that serve as bedding. In the dim red glow of embers, their faces look ancient and childlike all at once. The adults remain awake a while longer, listening. One feeds the last bits of bone and twig into the fire. Another uses a stick to stir the ashes, watching for the faintest flare of light. It's not certain whether Homo FLORESIENSIS could make fire from scratch. No hearths or fire pits have been found that clearly prove control. But ash deposits and charred animal bones suggest they used it when they could, perhaps capturing flame from natural blazes and nurturing it as long as possible. Tonight the glow is weak, but it's enough to keep the cold away and the darkness slightly at bay. Their world is small but intricate. Every sound holds meaning. The snap of a branch, the croak of a frog, the whisper of leaves that might conceal predator or prey. They know the terrain by touch and scent, the slope of the limestone hills, the shallow rivers cutting through volcanic plains, the hidden paths through ferns and pandanus. They wake before dawn to gather tubers or small fruits, hunt rodents or lizards, and sometimes catch birds with traps made from vines. But now, at this hour, the day contracts into listening. Survival is not just about action, it is about awareness. One might wonder what they thought as they stared into the dark. Did they imagine shapes in the shadows, or recall the memory of daylight hunts? Did they understand time, the difference between this night and the one before? Or did each evening simply feel like the same endless rhythm of hunger, rest, and vigilance? It's easy to forget that these people, so small and so ancient, lived entire lifetimes this way. Generations of them grew up, grew old, and vanished here long before modern humans ever saw the island. At some point, a soft rain begins to fall outside. It taps on the rock ledges and drips through cracks in the cave ceiling, forming small rivulets that glisten in the firelight. The smell of rain mingles with ash and earth, the scent of continuity. The hobbits shift in their sleep, their bodies huddled together, trusting warmth more than words. Outside, the predators retreat into the forest. The storm grows stronger, muffling the night. In the half-light before sleep, one adult lifts a hand, almost absently, to touch a pendant of polished bone or tooth hanging from a cord of twisted fibre. Such objects have not been found, but it is hard to imagine a people who chipped perfect tools from stone and shared the same caves for millennia without also keeping small tokens, objects that meant something beyond survival. Perhaps a child's gift, perhaps a sign of belonging. In the glow of dying embers, even the smallest details take on the weight of memory. Hours later, as dawn approaches, the storm subsides. The forest outside steams with humidity. Water drips steadily from the cave's roof. The fire has died completely now, leaving only grey ash. One of the hobbits stirs, stretching their arms and blinking toward the faint light creeping into the cave. A new day has come, indistinguishable from the last, and yet full of the quiet persistence that kept them alive for thousands of years. To us, their existence feels impossibly distant, but in truth, the rhythms of their life are not so alien. The cautious sharing of food, the protection of children, the small circle of warmth against the wild. These are instincts older than speech, older than art. On Flores they endured by doing what all humans have done, finding safety in togetherness, meaning in repetition, and comfort in the small flame that separates life from the dark. And if we could stand there now, unseen in that cave 70,000 years ago, we might not hear words, but we would understand everything. The hush, the care, the shared fear of the dark and the fragile hope that the light somehow would return. Picture this, a world so small that every sound carries meaning. Inside the limestone chamber of Liang Bua, shadows move in soft unison. A handful of Homo FLORESIENSIS sit close, no more than half a dozen, a family perhaps, or a gathering of kin. Their voices are low and rhythmic, more melody than language. One gesture leads to another. A look, a click of the tongue, a short burst of sound, enough to convey everything necessary for life here. In a land where danger could arrive on clawed feet or winged shadows, being understood meant being alive. Their entire civilization fits inside the echo of this cave. No cities, no walls, just bonds. The archaeological record offers silence. No ornaments, no carvings, no painted walls. But that silence is not emptiness. It's the quiet of simplicity, the absence of clutter in a world that required presence more than possessions. These people lived face to face, within arm's reach, within the radius of care. The social lives of these small humans must have been built on cooperation. On an island where a lone individual stood little chance against predators or scarcity, every hand mattered. Each member of a group this size was essential. A worker, a watcher, a memory keeper. They hunted together, or more likely scavenged in teams, using their stone tools to strip meat from a carcass before the Komodo dragons arrived. It would take coordination, one or two to cut, another to keep watch, others to carry bones or pieces of hide back to shelter. In that rhythm of shared action, a society forms, small, self-contained, efficient. Even without evidence of language carved into symbols, it's reasonable to imagine a rich vocal world. Human evolution had long favoured communication, the coordination of breath, sound, and intention. Even earlier species like Homo erectus likely used structured calls, and modern primates exhibit hundreds of nuanced vocalizations. Homo FLORESIENSIS surely built upon that foundation. A quick chirp to warn of a dragon, a low hum to signal comfort to a child. Laughter, maybe, a release of tension after danger passes. The same cognitive threads that shaped toolmaking would have supported meaning in sound. In isolation, that language might have become entirely unique, tuned to the acoustics of their caves and the calls of the forest. The island itself reinforced intimacy. Flores was not just a home, it was a boundary. There were no strangers, no neighbours from beyond the sea. Every member of the community was someone's kin. In such a closed loop, social harmony wasn't optional, it was survival strategy. A quarrel could divide a group and mean death in the forest. So cooperation became second nature, a genetic rhythm learned through necessity. The archaeological layers tell us that this species endured here for hundreds of thousands of years. You don't last that long without getting along. The daily routine probably revolved around tasks shared among all ages. Adults ventured out to gather tubers, fruits, or small prey, while the young learned by imitation. A child's hands copying the rhythm of stone flaking, a parent's gesture correcting the angle, not with words, but through repetition. Such transmission of skill is culture in its earliest form. When a way of striking a stone survives across generations, it carries memory, even without myth. Fire, if they controlled it at all, would have been a communal anchor. Around it they likely huddled to eat and rest. The glow would have softened their faces, revealing moments of familiarity we would recognise. A child dozing in the crook of a mother's arm, two adults exchanging glances across the embers, one elder slowly explaining through gesture and tone how to avoid the poisonous plants near the marsh. Whether or not those teachings were framed as stories, the act itself was storytelling. Survival wisdom woven through repetition and touch. Their small size, too, shaped how they interacted. Everything about their world was scaled down. The tools, the prey, the distances they travelled. Social interactions would have mirrored that intimacy. Closer proximity, softer sounds, smaller territories. In anthropology, this is known as a miniature ecology of behaviour. Energy conservation dictated their lives. Fewer calories meant smaller foraging ranges, shorter hunts, and tighter social units. This isn't a sign of limitation, but of perfect adaptation. They lived precisely within the bounds their world allowed. Perhaps their social structure resembled the kin-based clusters we see in small primate groups. 2 or 3 related females, a few males, offspring of various ages. Bonds formed not through dominance, but through familiarity. The same faces, the same tasks, the same cave, day after day. The emotional intensity of such constant contact would have been profound. On an island of giants and predators, trust was everything. When one member fell ill, others may have cared for them, if only to preserve the fragile balance of the group. Archaeological evidence from related species, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, even Australopithecus, shows that care and cooperation are deep-rooted behaviours. A broken bone that healed, a tooth worn smooth by old age. These traces tell us that ancient humans tended to one another. The Hobbits left no such direct evidence, but the logic of their survival points the same way. A single wound could cripple a being so small. The fact that they endured for thousands of generations suggests care, mutual defence, and shared vigilance. At night, when the jungle outside throbbed with sound, they may have slept close together for warmth and safety. Their small bodies radiating heat could have formed a living blanket against the damp air. Social bonding wasn't a luxury. It was thermoregulation, protection, and comfort intertwined. Perhaps soft touches, shared grooming, or rhythmic movements reinforced unity. Echoes of behaviours seen in many primates today. In such gestures, empathy would not have been philosophy but instinct. It's tempting to imagine how they saw one another. Did they recognise individuality the way we do? Did they name each other, even in simple vocal forms? When one died, from sickness, from a fall, from a dragon's bite, did the others pause, linger, feel absence? The archaeological silence leaves us guessing, yet it's difficult to believe that a species capable of making tools and nurturing young could live entirely without emotional depth. Their intelligence may have been small in volume but vast in function, the kind that expresses itself through connection, not invention. In the long quiet of Flores nights, the bonds between these people would have been their universe. No outsiders, no trade, no migration, just the same familiar eyes across every firelight. Every generation born into a lineage of shared survival. Isolation often breeds fragility, but here it bred endurance. These tiny humans created the simplest, most durable social system imaginable. A circle of trust that lasted hundreds of millennia. Their story, though mute in the fossil record, whispers through inference. We can't hear their language, but we can read its rhythm in their persistence. 1,000,000 years of storms, eruptions, and shifting forests, and still they endured, not through dominance or brilliance, but through cohesion. On Flores, society was not a structure but a heartbeat, small, steady, unbroken. In that sense, Homo Floresiensis may remind us of the oldest human truth of all. We were never meant to live alone. Even in miniature, even with the humblest minds, survival depended on one another. Their world was small, but within it, they carried the vast design of humanity, cooperation, care, and the quiet need to belong. Imagine this. The air of Flores heavy with the smell of wet earth and rot, the chorus of insect echoing through the forest, and in the dim light of dawn, a small figure crouched beside the carcass of a dwarf elephant. The animal's flank is torn open, its ribs exposed. The scavenger doesn't speak, doesn't shout for others. She moves quickly, precisely, working a sharp flake of stone into the meat while watching the shadows. Behind her, a Komodo dragon watches too, unblinking. For Homo Floresiensis, every meal began with risk. Eat fast, eat quietly, and leave before something larger decides the menu has changed. On Flores, food was never guaranteed. The island was lush but deceptive, a paradise of scarcity. Its dense jungles hid fruit and tubers, its rivers teemed with fish and crustaceans, but calories were hard to come by. The hobbits were small, yes, but they still burned energy walking, climbing, and thinking. They needed meat, fat, and starch in a landscape ruled by predators and constrained by isolation. So, they adapted. Archaeologists reading the bones and soils of Liang Bua Cave have found the remnants of their meals. Scattered rat skulls, cracked bones of lizards and birds, and on rare occasions fragments of Stegodon florensis insularis, the dwarf elephant of Flores. These animals, though tiny compared to their mainland ancestors, were still massive compared to their hunters. A full-grown stegodon could weigh several hundred kilograms, towering over a hobbit whose head barely reached its belly. Yet, on the bones of these ancient elephants, researchers found fine cut marks, not the random scratches of scavengers, but the deliberate incisions of stone blades. It's evidence that Homo Floresiensis had learned somehow to access large prey. Whether they hunted or scavenged those elephants remains a mystery. The idea of a band of meat-tall humans bringing down such a beast seems improbable, but not impossible. Perhaps they targeted juveniles, calves separated from the herd or stuck in the soft mud of volcanic plains. Or perhaps they simply waited. The tropical climate of Flores meant that carcasses decomposed quickly, and large predators often left remains half-consumed. The hobbits, small and agile, could have darted in after a Komodo dragon's feast, stripping off what meat remained before retreating to their caves. If that was the case, their sharp tools were not just weapons, but keys, unlocking sustenance in a dangerous ecological hierarchy. But the bones tell us that such feasts were rare. Most of the remains in Liang Bua belong to creatures far smaller, particularly the giant rats that once dominated Flores. These rodents were the perfect prey for a small-bodied hunter, large enough to be worth catching, slow enough to catch by hand or with simple traps. Some species weighed up to 2 kilograms, about the size of a rabbit. Their bones litter the cave deposits in such numbers that scientists believe they were a dietary staple. It's likely that the hobbits trapped them near burrows, used sticks or stones to club them, and roasted them whole. The smell of sizzling rat fat, unappetizing to us, might have been the smell of home to them. Alongside the rats were reptiles, lizards, snakes, and perhaps even young Komodo dragons. Their skins and bones appear in fragmentary remains, often near ash deposits. And though we can't be certain how often Homo floresiensis used fire, the presence of heat-altered bones suggests that at least occasionally they managed to roast or smoke their food. Other sources of nourishment were likely gathered rather than hunted: bird eggs, fruits from forest trees, roots, and starchy tubers dug from volcanic soil. In a world without agriculture, the island itself was their larder. Still, Flores was not generous without consequence. For every meal found, there was another that could easily have gone the other way. Komodo dragons, the true apex predators of the island, would have regarded these small humans not as competition, but as prey. Even a single bite from a dragon's bacteria-rich jaws could prove fatal. The hobbits must have learned to read the forest for signs of danger: a shifting branch, a streak of scales against the ground, the sudden silence of birds. They may have relied on caves like Liang Bua not just for shelter, but for safety. Refuges high enough or narrow enough to deter the dragons from entering. What little evidence remains of their tools tells us that food preparation was methodical. The same sharp flakes used for cutting hides or shaping wood could slice through sinew with ease. Cut marks on animal bones suggest they stripped meat cleanly, perhaps saving bones to crack later for marrow. The precision of those cuts reveals not frenzy but control. A small mind focused on an essential task. The ability to process food efficiently meant survival through lean seasons when fruits were scarce and prey hid deep in the forest. In that same forest, competition was relentless. The island's giant storks likely fed on small animals, perhaps even young hobbits, though that remained speculation. The landscape itself could be an enemy. Dense vegetation, slippery volcanic soils, and monsoon floods that reshaped the terrain each year. In such conditions, adaptability mattered more than dominance. The hobbits' small size and agility may have allowed them to exploit niches that larger species ignored, climbing trees for eggs or fruits, digging roots in steep gullies, or crawling into narrow crevices to retrieve trapped animals. Occasionally, when fortune aligned, they might have come across a stegodon carcass freshly killed by a landslide or weakened by old age. Those would have been moments of abundance, the entire group feasting, using every scrap of the animal. The meat could be dried in the open air, bones repurposed for tools or weapons, sinews twisted into bindings. For a few days they would have eaten like kings of the island, and yet, just beyond the tree line, another dragon waited. This balance of predator and prey, hunter and hunted, defined their existence. On Flores, life operated at the scale of immediacy. There was no hoarding, no agriculture, no storage of wealth. Everything was eaten, used, or lost. That rhythm may sound brutal, but it was sustainable. They lived in harmony with a world that never promised tomorrow, but always offered just enough today. One of the most fascinating aspects of their ecology is how well Homo floresiensis fit into the island's food chain without overwhelming it. Unlike modern humans, they didn't dominate their ecosystem. They adapted to it. Their population likely stayed small, limited by resources, disease, and predation. But this limitation may have been their strength. For nearly 1 million years, they persisted on Flores, finding balance in a system that punished excess. And while the thought of eating giant rats might make us recoil, it's worth remembering that these little people were masters of making do. They took what nature gave and turned it into continuity. Every gnawed bone in Liang Bua, every chipped tool beside it, is a testament to that quiet efficiency. They lived by the oldest rule of all: survive by understanding your place, not by conquering it. So when we picture them crouched by a fire, gnawing at roasted meat or passing a piece of fruit between them, we should see more than hunger. We should see intelligence, not of the cerebral kind, but of adaptation. They knew when to hunt, when to hide, when to scavenge, and when to wait. Their brains may have been small, but their wisdom was vast, written in instinct and honed by countless generations of trial and success. In the end, their menu tells us more than their bones ever could. It tells us that life on Flores was not about triumph, but balance, the art of existing between what can be eaten and what might eat you. Imagine this, the island of Flores trembling beneath its own heartbeat. The ground shudders, and the trees sway under a rain of ash. The air thickens with dust. In the darkness, the small figures of Homo FLORESIENSIS crouch beneath overhangs and rocky shelters, eyes wide, lungs burning. The sky has turned the colour of iron. Nothing moves except the trembling leaves coated in grey. For a people who lived by the rhythm of daylight, this was more than a storm. It was the island itself reminding them that paradise can break. Flores was never still. It was born from fire, a volcanic spine rising from the sea, and for nearly 1 million years it lived in a cycle of creation and destruction. The Hobbits, by the time they appeared, were already inheritors of an unstable world. Their small island existed between two extremes: drought and deluge, ash and rain, abundance and famine. Each shift in the global climate redrew the boundaries of their home. When glaciers spread across the northern continents, the world's oceans fell and Flores grew. Broad coastal plains emerged, exposing reefs and mangrove forests rich with new food. But when the ice retreated, the seas rose again, swallowing those same plains and isolating the hobbits once more within shrinking pockets of land. Their world expanded and contracted like a living thing. For Homo FLORESIENSIS, these changes were not abstract geological events. They were daily realities. The rivers they followed might dry into cracked earth for years, only to flood again when monsoon rains returned. Forests once dense with fruiting trees might thin into dry grasslands, forcing the hobbits to abandon foraging routes they had known for generations. Then, slowly, the rains would come back, and with them, the green. Survival required flexibility, not just in body but in habit. A people who stood barely a metre tall learned to navigate a world that reshaped itself every few centuries. The evidence of these upheavals lies in the layers of sediment inside Liang Bua Cave. Each layer tells a different story. Ash from eruptions, silt from floods, dark patches of organic soil from calmer periods of habitation. Around 100,000 years ago, the climate of Southeast Asia began one of its great swings. As glaciers advanced in the north, the tropics cooled and dried. On Flores, the rainforest retreated, giving way to savanna-like grasslands. The animals changed too. The dwarf elephants grew rarer, while rats and reptiles became the dominant fauna. For the hobbits, this meant a shift in strategy. They would have had to travel farther between water sources, hunt smaller prey, and endure harsher, colder nights. Then, around 74,000 years ago, came one of the most catastrophic events in Earth's history, the Toba super eruption. On the island of Sumatra, far to the west, a volcano exploded with such force that it cast ash across continents. The skies darkened for months, perhaps years, plunging much of Asia into a volcanic winter. Though Flores lay more than 2,000 kilometres away, the effects likely reached it. Fine ash settled over the forests, filtering sunlight, cooling the air, and disrupting the cycles of plants and animals. For a small population already living close to the edge, even a modest decline in temperature or vegetation could have meant famine. We can't know exactly how the Hobbits experienced this global crisis, but the evidence of disturbance is there. An interruption in the fossil layers, a thinning of remains. Perhaps entire generations were lost. Perhaps only a few pockets survived in the most sheltered valleys where springs still flowed and edible plants endured. For a time, the island must have felt empty. But Flores, like the Hobbits themselves, was resilient. The eruption ash would have eventually enriched the soil, and life returned in bursts of green. Rivers flowed again, forests grew back, and the rhythms of the island resumed. Homo floresiensis persisted through these oscillations, adapting with the patience of a lineage that had long learned to endure without control. They could not shape the weather, but they could wait it out. Volcanism, however, was under constant danger. Geological surveys show that Flores was ringed with active systems even during the late Pleistocene. Some layers in Liang Bua record localized ash falls, silent witnesses to eruptions that blanketed the landscape. The youngest of these layers, dated to around 50,000 years ago, coincides eerily with the disappearance of Homo floresiensis fossils. Whether coincidence or causation, it marks a turning point. Perhaps a nearby volcano erupted violently enough to devastate the vegetation, poisoning rivers with ash and suffocating prey species. The Hobbits, already few in number, might have retreated into smaller refuges, unable to recover from the collapse of their ecosystem. Even smaller environmental fluctuations could have compounded the crisis. Droughts would have reduced plant growth, leading to hunger among herbivores, and in turn among the hobbits who hunted or scavenged them. Forest fires, common in dry seasons, could have driven both prey and people from their shelters. The very caves that once protected them might have filled with smoke or debris. In an ecosystem so finely balanced, a single bad decade could erase centuries of stability. Yet what is most striking is not their disappearance, but how long they endured before it. Across hundreds of millennia, through countless cycles of climate and catastrophe, Homo floresiensis held their ground. Unlike larger species that vanished quickly, these tiny humans adapted again and again. When the forest shrank, they hunted rats. When rivers changed course, they followed new ones. When ash darkened the sky, they survived on roots and insects. Every challenge was met with quiet ingenuity. They were not masters of their environment, they were its students. It's humbling to consider that while we often think of evolution as progress, here was a lineage that embodied endurance instead. They didn't invent new tools for every change or build shelters to defy the weather. They endured by fitting into the rhythm of the island, by needing less, by taking only what could be found. In that sense, their survival strategy was more sustainable than ours has ever been. Perhaps their smallness was their strength. A smaller body requires fewer resources. A smaller group leaves a lighter footprint. In times of scarcity, that efficiency could have been the difference between survival and extinction. For most of the Ice Age it worked, until, one day, it didn't. The earth shifted again. The air turned dry or the ground erupted, and this time the island asked more than the hobbits could give. There is something profoundly human in that story. Across every continent, species of early humans have faced the same test, not of intelligence, but of endurance. The forces of climate and geology are indifferent to cleverness. They erase what cannot adapt fast enough. Homo floresiensis adapted for longer than most. When we find their bones sealed under volcanic layers, It isn't tragedy we're uncovering. It's a record of persistence, of a people who survived everything until they couldn't. In Liang Bua Cave today, you can still see the ash layers from those ancient eruptions, fine as dust but heavy with history. Each one marks a moment when the island burned, when life began again. Somewhere between them lies the final trace of the Hobbits, a small people who outlasted storms, droughts, and the breath of volcanoes, until the island that had shaped them for so long finally changed beyond recognition. Their story reminds us that no paradise is permanent, and no species stands apart from the earth that feeds it. Every human, large or small, ancient or modern, lives at the mercy of the same planet. The difference is how long we listen before it shifts again. Imagine this, the sound of paddles striking water in the dawn fog. The sea between the islands lies calm and silver, but the world is about to change forever. On a quiet morning somewhere around 50,000 years ago, a small boat glides toward the volcanic shores of Flores. In it sit humans who look like us, Homo sapiens, lean, upright, their hands wrapped around spears tipped with stone and resin. They are travellers from the west, moving island by island through the chain of Wallacea on their way to lands beyond. Their destination is unknown to them, but their arrival marks the edge of another story, a story already many hundreds of thousands of years old. Waiting inland, in the tangled green of a forest, are the last survivors of Homo FLORESIENSIS. No evidence proves these two kinds of humans ever met, and yet the timing tempts belief. Around this same window in time, the fossils of the Hobbits vanish from the archaeological record. The last hearth of Liang Bua cools, the stone tools stop appearing in the sediment, and silence settles over the cave. The coincidence is almost too perfect. If modern humans had reached Australia by roughly 65 to 50,000 years ago, they must have passed through this same island corridor, Timor, Sulawesi, and perhaps Flores itself. Somewhere between those waves and that timeline, we came close enough that their shadows might have crossed ours. Flores was not an easy island to reach. The surrounding seas were deep, and even at the lowest glacial tides it remained cut off from the Asian mainland. Whoever first crossed into it, whether Homo erectus hundreds of millennia earlier, or Homo sapiens in this later wave, did so with intention or by accident, riding the currents, trusting the winds. The people who came in these later millennia were masters of both. They had long since learned to make watercraft, to plan journeys across open sea, and to carry with them not just tools but stories, fire and memory. To the Hobbits, had they still been alive, these tall, loud newcomers would have seemed like spirits from another realm. If the meeting occurred, it would have been one of the strangest encounters in human prehistory. Two species of the same genus, separated by more than 1 million years of evolution, standing face to face under the same sun. One small and ancient, shaped by isolation and scarcity. The other large, curious, and armed with a technology of expansion. In that moment, the Earth briefly held a mirror to itself. Perhaps the newcomers never even saw the Hobbits alive. It is entirely possible that when the first Homo sapiens explorers set foot on Flores, the little people were already gone, their bones buried beneath ash and their tools gathering dust in Liang Bua. But if contact did happen, it would have been brief, delicate, and irreversible. The island's resources were limited. Two human species could not easily share it. The forest could feed only so many mouths. A small, slow-moving population like Homo FLORESIENSIS, numbering perhaps only a few hundred, could have been displaced within a generation simply by competition. Not war, just presence. Our ancestors, with their wider range of foods and more complex cooperation, would have consumed what the hobbits relied upon. The giant rats, the fruit-bearing trees, the waterholes. And perhaps without meaning to, they brought invisible dangers. Diseases carried by the wind or blood that the hobbits had never encountered before. On an island where survival depended on delicate balance, even one sickness could unweave an entire population. We have no fossils of Homo sapiens on Flores dating precisely to this moment, but their traces appear nearby, in Sulawesi, in Timor, in Australia soon after. The path between those dots passes directly through Flores. It's as if we arrived just as the lights were going out. In Liang Bua, the youngest hobbit bones date to around 50,000 years ago. Above them, the sediments grow quiet. No fire, no tools, no teeth, just absence. Some scientists think the end was swift. The hobbits, already diminished by volcanic change and shrinking forests, may have been unable to compete with the new arrivals. Others think the end was slower, that the last bands retreated into hidden valleys or higher caves, surviving a few centuries more, dwindling generation by generation, until they vanished unseen. There's another, softer possibility, that our ancestors never encountered them directly at all, but arrived to find their traces still fresh. Imagine a group of Homo sapiens explorers entering Liang Bua Cave, their torches throwing light onto the walls. They find stone flakes and bones scattered across the floor, perhaps still bearing the faint scent of smoke. They pause, look around, and feel the weight of presence. Another kind of human had lived here. Another fire had burned in this same space. The silence would have been unsettling. Perhaps that silence gave birth to the first island stories, tales of little forest people, seen in glimpses, half remembered by those who came later. To imagine this meeting is to hold a paradox. Two species of human, both self-aware, both shaped by evolution's long patience, yet separated by fate. One carrying 1,000,000 years of solitude, the other carrying an unrelenting momentum of expansion. For Homo FLORESIENSIS, survival meant fitting perfectly into an ecosystem. For Homo sapiens, survival meant reshaping ecosystems to fit us. Those two strategies could not share the same island for long. The extinction of the hobbits may have been unintentional, an ecological side effect of our arrival. When the larger humans hunted, they would have over-harvested prey already stretched thin by drought and ash. The dwarf elephants, the rats, the birds, all the small puzzle pieces that kept Flores alive, might have vanished one by one. Without those supports, the hobbits would have followed. In the archaeological record, this pattern echoes across time. Wherever we arrived, species disappeared. On Flores, the same pattern likely unfolded quietly, without war cries or fire, just a gradual fading of one world beneath another. And yet the idea that two human species might have shared a moment, a look, even a hesitation, lingers. One can picture it. Tall strangers approaching a clearing where a group of hobbits stand motionless, clutching their tools, the air thick with humidity and curiosity. The newcomers hold torches, the little ones blink at the light. They don't flee, they don't attack, they just stare, seeing themselves reflected in a distorted form. For a heartbeat of time, the entire history of our genus hangs in that silence. Then the moment passes, the torchlight moves on, the forest swallows the smaller ones again. What makes this story haunting isn't conquest, but connection. These weren't aliens meeting humans. They were humans meeting themselves, the echo of what could have been. Every instinct, every gesture would have felt familiar yet strange. The hands that chipped stone, the eyes that watched from the dark. Not beasts, but kin. The distance between us and them wasn't moral or mystical. It was evolutionary and terribly thin. We can't prove that such a meeting took place, but whether it did or not, our arrival marks the same turning point in the fossil record, the end of one branch and the dominance of another. From that moment onward, the world belonged to only one kind of human. When modern humans stepped onto Flores, the planet was already closing its doors on diversity. Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, and the Hobbits of Flores. One by one, they disappeared within the same few millennia. Evolution had spent millions of years experimenting with the human form, and then, almost overnight, all but one vanished. The stage was cleared, and we stood alone. Perhaps that's why the discovery of Homo floresiensis feels less like science fiction and more like confession. It reminds us that our story is not linear or destined, but crowded and fragile. For a very long time, we were not the only humans. We were simply the ones who remained. And if somewhere, on a quiet dawn 50,000 years ago, two species of humanity did look across the firelight at each other, one small and enduring, the other tall and relentless, then that meeting was both a farewell and a beginning. The last echo of the world before us, and the first step into the world we would make alone. Imagine this. The last fire flickers low in a limestone cave on a humid island in the middle of the Ice Age sea. Beyond its faint glow, the rainforest hums, the night creatures move, and the air is thick with the same pulse that has sustained life here for hundreds of thousands of years. Somewhere inside that cave, one of the last Homo floresiensis exhales, unaware that no one of their kind will do so again. There will be no ceremony, no witness, no name, only sediment and silence. And then the echoes stop. The story of extinction is rarely sudden. It creeps. It arrives disguised as hunger, as drought, as the slow thinning of sound and company. Around 50,000 years ago, something changed on Flores. Not just in the fossils, but in the rhythm of the land itself. The youngest bones of Homo floresiensis date to about 60,000 years ago, and the last stone flakes we can attribute to them disappear a little later, around 50,000. After that, nothing. No more hearths, no more tools, no more bones small enough to belong to a person barely a metre tall. It's as though an entire people had simply folded into the earth. The simplest answer might be the hardest to accept, that the little humans of Flores succumb to the same forces that rule every island species: isolation, scarcity, and time. For hundreds of millennia, they had balanced delicately between resource and survival, adapting to the island's cycles of abundance and loss. But balance can only last so long. Each glacial swing, each shift in rainfall, each eruption or disease could chip away at their numbers. The smaller a population becomes, the easier it is to fall off the edge. One of the leading hypotheses ties their disappearance to environmental collapse. Geological layers in Liang Bua show traces of ash and sediment linked to volcanic activity around that same time. Perhaps a nearby volcano erupted, coating the forest in dust, choking rivers, and wiping out plants and prey alike. On Flores, such an event would have been catastrophic. The island's food web was already limited. Dwarf elephants, giant rats, a few bird species, and plants that flowered in unpredictable cycles. A season or two of ash could have starved everything from the ground up. The stegodons, those small elephant-like grazers, vanish from the record right around the same horizon. Their extinction may have been the domino that toppled the rest. The hobbits had endured droughts and floods before, but without their largest prey, and with forests damaged by ashfall, the fragile thread of sustenance may have snapped, and yet the timing still tempts another explanation. Around 50,000 years ago, modern humans, Homo sapiens, were moving rapidly through Southeast Asia. We know they had reached Australia by this point, which means they must have crossed these waters, perhaps even Flores itself. Whether they found the Hobbits still clinging to life or only their ghosts, the overlap is difficult to ignore. Some researchers suggest that even without confrontation, the arrival of our species could have reshaped the island's balance. We were efficient hunters, we brought new technologies, and most dangerously, we brought new pressures. Imagine an island where every calorie counts, every ecological role is tightly wound. Then add a new player, tall, far-ranging humans who burn wood for fire, fish in rivers, and hunt the same prey. The competition doesn't have to be violent to be fatal. In a few short centuries, Homo FLORESIENSIS could have been outcompeted simply by being outnumbered. The larger humans ate more, moved faster, and adapted broadly. The smaller ones were specialists in an ecosystem now unravelling. Disease could have played its part too. When isolated populations meet newcomers, pathogens can move faster than weapons. A cough, a cut, a fever carried from island to island could have raced through the tiny Flores population with devastating speed. For a species reduced to a few hundred individuals, even a minor epidemic could erase generations. There's another quieter mechanism, demographic fragility. In any small population, randomness itself becomes an enemy. A few bad years of drought, a landslide that wipes out a key group, a skewed sex ratio where too few children survive. These are not catastrophes on a global scale, but on an island they can end a lineage. Over time, genetic inbreeding may have weakened immune systems or reduced fertility. Every birth and every death mattered. If a few critical individuals died too soon, knowledge could vanish along with them. How to nap the right kind of stone, how to find a certain route, how to avoid the caves where Komodo dragons hunted. Once that chain of teaching breaks, survival turns to chance. In truth, it was likely not one cause, but all of them. A perfect storm of misfortune. Climate instability, ecological loss, competition, and demographic fragility braided together into an invisible noose. And because their population was small to begin with, they would have vanished quietly. There is no sign of massacre, no fossilized battle, no sudden ash layer filled with bones. Only the steady fading of traces layer by layer until the cave floor falls silent. What makes their disappearance so poignant is how long they endured before it. For nearly 1 million years, the ancestors of Homo FLORESIENSIS survived every curveball the Pleistocene could throw. Tsunamis, droughts, volcanic winters, predators, isolation. They adapted by becoming smaller, leaner, and more resourceful. In evolutionary terms, they won the long game, until they didn't. Their extinction came not in their decline, but in our rise. If we could stand at the threshold of their ending, it might not have looked like tragedy. There would have been no moment of awareness, no sense of finality. A mother would still gather food, a child still play near the cave mouth, unaware that the world beyond was changing too fast. The last generation of Homo FLORESIENSIS likely lived much like the first. Small bands moving through the forest, cautious, competent, enduring. Extinction from inside probably feels like continuity. Until one day, there's no one left to remember. When scientists later excavated Liang Bua, they found that last quiet chapter written in soil and ash. The bones rested among layers of stalagmite dust and animal remains, sealed by time. For years, researchers thought the species had survived until just 12,000 years ago, a shockingly recent date. But more precise dating corrected the record. The Hobbits had vanished tens of thousands of years earlier. Even so, their survival deep into the late Pleistocene remains astonishing. They were living, breathing humans, just not like us, long after Neanderthals and Denisovans had begun their decline. They were the final holdouts of a wilder world. The image of their end feels almost mythic, though it is built on data. An island slowly empties of sound. The dwarf elephants are gone. The forest thins. The river runs quieter. A few small figures remain in the hills, their fires faint and infrequent. One last cave family persists a little longer, unaware that they are the last of their kind. When the final ember fades, the story ends, not with fire, but with darkness. It is tempting to look for meaning in that silence, but perhaps the only meaning is endurance itself. For nearly 1 million years, these little humans held their ground at the far edge of the world, proving that intelligence and survival need not come in large packages. Their extinction wasn't failure, it was inevitability. Every species has a horizon, and Homo floresiensis simply reached theirs earlier than we did. Still, their absence feels heavy. On this island, once filled with their laughter, their careful work, their tiny footprints, nothing remains but the stone ghosts of their tools and the delicate bones of their bodies. And yet, in those remnants lies a quiet victory. They lived, adapted, and persisted in a place where no one expected humans to be at all. If you were standing in Liang Bua today, in the same twilight that once brushed their faces, you might still feel them. The cool draught of the cave, the cheer of night insects, the echo of dripping water, everything they once knew remains. The difference is that we are the only ones left to listen. Imagine wandering through the forests of Flores long before modern roads and lights, when the night still belonged to the crickets and the sound of unseen wings brushing the canopy. Villagers told stories of small, hairy beings who crept from the woods at dusk, who stole grain from storage huts and whispered in strange, high voices. They were mischievous, unpredictable, and oddly human. The locals called them Ebu Gogo, the grandmother who eats everything. For generations, these tales flowed through the oral traditions of Flores, spoken beside fires, passed from elders to children. When Western scientists first arrived in the early 21st century and uncovered the bones of a small ancient human in Liang Bua Cave, the resonance between legend and fossil seemed uncanny. Could the islanders have remembered somehow what the earth had long since buried? The Ebagogo stories describe beings about the height of a small child, covered in hair, walking upright but with awkward movements, able to mimic human speech yet not quite speak it. They lived in caves, feared fire, and scavenged food from human villages. Some tales even say they were eventually hunted down by local people, who trapped them in caves and burned them out. In the Western imagination, such stories sound like fables, cautionary myths about greed or wildness. Yet on Flores they are told with a tone of half-belief, as if recalling an uncomfortable truth just out of reach. The likeness to Homo floresiensis is striking. A small, tool-using, cave-dwelling human relative whose existence no one on the island could have known about when the folklore arose. The first Western record of Ebu Gogo legends came from anthropologists in the early 1900s, long before the discovery of the fossils in 2003. The stories were already deeply rooted in the island's cultural landscape. When archaeologists announced the find of a tiny hominin from Liang Bua, the local response wasn't disbelief, it was recognition. "We have always known about them," some said. "You've just found their bones." That reaction blurs the line between myth and memory in a way that science often struggles to interpret. Could an oral tradition preserve fragments of an encounter tens of thousands of years old? Or do all human societies, encountering ancient bones or imagining the forest mysteries, invent small people who once shared the world with them? Anthropologists caution against reading too much literal truth into folklore. The gap between the disappearance of Homo floresiensis around 50,000 years ago, and the first appearance of Ibu Gogo tails is unimaginably long. Entire cultures have risen and fallen in less time. The likelihood that any living memory could bridge that distance is infinitesimal. More plausibly, the legends reflect universal storytelling instincts, the urge to humanize the unknown, to populate the dark with half-familiar shapes. When villagers found fossilized bones or stone tools in the caves of Flores, long before archaeologists arrived, it would have been natural to assign them to a little people, rather than to ancient humans. The stories might also reflect encounters with other real, small primates once native to the region, like macaques, or perhaps stem from symbolic retellings of encounters between earlier and later human groups elsewhere in Southeast Asia. Still, there is something haunting in the convergence. Around the world, independent cultures tell stories of small forest people, mischievous, elusive, neither fully human nor fully animal. In Europe they were brownies and kobolds, in Africa the tokoloshi, in Southeast Asia the orang pendek of Sumatra. Folklorists have noted that these myths often emerge in places where fossil bones or archaeological traces of earlier humans are common. It's as if the human imagination, sensing the depth of time beneath its feet, cannot resist populating it. The Ebu Gogo of Flores fit perfectly into that pattern, a bridge between myth and prehistory, between remembered presence and scientific rediscovery. When scientists speak with humility, they admit that not all stories have to be factual to hold truth. The people of Flores were keepers of the island's memory long before carbon dating or excavation. Their stories remind us that cultural knowledge, myth, song, oral tradition, can act as an archive, not of data but of relationship. The Ebu Gogo tales tell us less about exact timelines, and more about how humans everywhere grapple with the feeling that we were not alone. Even after Homo Floresiensis vanished, the forest must have felt inhabited by their absence. The wind in the caves, the strange tracks on riverbanks, the echoing cries at night, all invited explanation. Myth is the way memory dreams. Perhaps somewhere in the distant past there really was a brief overlap, a meeting between tall newcomers and the last small inhabitants of Flores. The encounter might have been fleeting, violent, or simply confusing. The newcomers, puzzled by these small, nimble beings, might have described them to their descendants as wild little humans. Over generations, as the facts blurred, the image remained: short, hairy, clever, and hungry. The Ebu Gogo could be a cultural fossil of that first bewildered contact, or perhaps not. Maybe the bones in Liang Bua and the stories of Flores share only coincidence, not continuity. Either way, the resemblance connects scientific discovery to the oldest kind of knowledge, storytelling born from living close to the land. In modern Flores, the line between legend and heritage has softened. Some locals treat the Ebu Gogo as real spirits, others as ancestors. After the Homo Floresiensis discovery, the tales gained new life. People began to point out certain caves and valleys, saying, "That's where they lived." The scientific find didn't erase the folklore, it enriched it, giving the island's stories a new dimension. It's a rare moment when archaeology and myth lean toward each other instead of apart. When we think of Homo Floresiensis today, it's tempting to see them only as specimens, skulls and limb bones measured and scanned in laboratories, but perhaps their truest legacy lives in the stories whispered about them. If the Ebu Gogo are even partly an echo of the Hobbits, then Homo Floresiensis didn't vanish entirely. They linger in imagination, the most resilient ecosystem of all. The caves of Flores still echo at night. The wind that moves through them is the same wind that once carried laughter or speech we can no longer decipher. Maybe the Ebu Gogo never existed exactly as described. Or maybe, like all myths, they exist precisely where truth and wonder meet, in the space between the known and the remembered. Imagine waking up one morning to headlines claiming a brand new species of human had just been discovered. A 3-foot-tall hobbit that lived astonishingly recently, long after Neanderthals had disappeared. That was the world in late 2004, when researchers from Indonesia and Australia announced the find from Liang Bua Cave on the island of Flores. Within hours, newspaper front pages and academic inboxes were ablaze. Could this really be another kind of human? One that had survived until almost yesterday? Or had science stumbled upon a medical mystery buried in ancient dust? The story began with bones. The small skeleton labelled LB1 was unlike anything the excavators expected to find. The skull, about the size of a grapefruit, sat atop a body barely a metre tall, yet the skeleton was unmistakably adult, its wisdom teeth fully erupted, its bones thick and weathered by life. The research team proposed that this was a new species, Homo FLORESIENSIS, and published their findings in Nature. The claim was breathtaking. It meant that a diminutive cousin of ours had persisted in isolation until at least the late Ice Age, perhaps even sharing the planet with early Homo sapiens. For a discipline accustomed to slow, careful adjustments to timelines, this was an earthquake. But science does not move on wonder alone. Almost immediately, critics stepped forward. Some pathologists argued that LB1 might be a modern human suffering from microcephaly, a condition that produces an abnormally small brain and short stature. Others suggested cretinism caused by thyroid deficiency, or that the bones might belong to a population of pygmy Homo sapiens whose features had become distorted by disease. The debates filled conference halls and academic journals for years. The very nickname Hobbit, endearing to the public, became divisive in the field, a word that could either spark laughter or a furious rebuttal, depending on which side of the argument one stood. Teams of specialists set out to test every alternative explanation. Comparative anatomists measured hundreds of human skulls, from modern pygmies to microcephalic individuals, and none matched the strange combination of traits found in LB1. Its jaw lacked a chin altogether, its wrists and shoulders were shaped more like those of early Homo erectus, or even Australopithecus, and its brain, though small, had a configuration unlike any modern human's. In 2005, further excavations revealed additional individuals, at least 14 in total, each sharing the same distinctive proportions. A pathology could explain one skeleton, perhaps two, but not an entire population. Slowly, the argument shifted. Neuroanthropologist Dean Falk and her team took CT scans of the tiny skull, creating an endocast to study the internal surface of the brain case. What they found astonished them. Though the brain volume was only about 400 cubic centimetres, roughly 1/3 of ours, its shape suggested expanded areas linked to higher cognition. The frontal and temporal lobes were well developed, resembling a scaled-down version of more advanced humans rather than a malformed brain. Falk's findings, published in 2005, became a turning point. They implied that Homo FLORESIENSIS had evolved a compact but efficient brain, not a diseased one. The Hobbits were beginning to stand on their own scientific feet. Meanwhile, the question of timing grew more complex. Initial carbon dating results indicated an age as young as 18,000 years, later misreported as 12,000, a figure that electrified the public but made many scientists uneasy. Could such archaic humans really have lived alongside fully modern people in Indonesia until the dawn of recorded history? As excavation layers were re-examined and dating methods refined, the picture changed. By 2007, new stratigraphic analysis and radiometric testing revealed that the bones were far older, the youngest between about 60 and 50,000 years before present. The earlier recent survival had been an artifact of mixed sediments. Though this correction disappointed those dreaming of near-modern coexistence, it grounded the discovery in firmer scientific soil. The Hobbits were ancient, but real. Across the next few years, fieldwork at Liang Bua and nearby sites added to the puzzle. The team recovered more stone tools, charcoal fragments, and animal bones showing butchery marks. Each piece helped confirm that these small people were long-term inhabitants of the island, not transient visitors. In 2008, statistical studies comparing limb proportions across species demonstrated that Homo floresiensis fell far outside modern human variation, aligning more closely with early Homo erectus. The consensus slowly crystallized. These were not deformed Homo sapiens at all, but a distinct offshoot of the human family tree that had been evolving in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years. Yet even as acceptance grew, humility remained. The scientists themselves emphasized how provisional their conclusions were. The tropical heat and acidic soils of Flores made DNA recovery nearly impossible, depriving them of genetic confirmation. Without it, every bone had to speak for itself. The debates shifted from are they real to where did they come from, and what does this mean for the story of us? For many researchers, that uncertainty was not a weakness but a strength, a reminder that paleoanthropology thrives on questioning itself. The process was not always graceful. At one international meeting in the mid-2000s, a researcher quipped that calling it Homo floresiensis is premature. Let's call it Homo controversialis. Another retorted that refusing to name it would be like ignoring the elephant, or in this case, the dwarf elephant, in the room. Beneath the humour lay genuine awe. The find challenged long-held assumptions about brain size, intelligence, and what it meant to be human. If a creature with such a small brain could make tools and survive for so long, perhaps cognition was more about wiring than volume. By the end of the decade, the argument had largely settled. Most specialists accepted Homo floresiensis as a legitimate species of archaic human, descended perhaps from Homo erectus populations that reached Flores nearly 1 million years earlier. Its discovery redefined the boundaries of the human story, expanding it sideways instead of upward. The Hobbits were not evolutionary mistakes or curiosities. They were proof that human evolution was a bush, not a ladder, full of side paths, experiments, and survivors who thrived in ways we once thought impossible. Looking back, the years between 2004 and 2010 read like a miniature case study in how science grows. A discovery shocks the system, doubt rises, data accumulates, and consensus emerges not through belief, but through attrition of error. The Hobbit humans had to be debated, remeasured, and sometimes ridiculed before they could be accepted. That is how truth hardens, under pressure, through correction. In the end, Homo floresiensis stepped out of myth and into science twice. Once when their bones were unearthed, and again when skepticism itself became the proof of their endurance. What began as a sensational headline matured into one of the most humbling realizations of modern anthropology, that intelligence, adaptability, and the spark of humanity have worn many faces, some no larger than a child's, all part of the same great experiment of survival. Imagine finding a fossil that rewrites our family tree, and then realizing you can't read its DNA. For all our tools and technology, the Hobbits of Flores still refuse to tell us who they truly were. In the 21st century, we can reconstruct the genomes of mammoths, Neanderthals, and Denisovans from fragments of ancient bone. Yet the little people of Liang Bua remain mute, their genetic code long dissolved in the warm, wet soil of the tropics. We can see their bones, measure their skulls, trace the curvature of their feet, but their molecular signature, their voice in the great evolutionary choir, is missing. Shortly after the discovery, researchers tried to coax whispers of DNA from the fossils. In 2006, small samples were drilled from a tooth and bone fragment, the drills humming like surgical bees in sterile labs in Jakarta and Canberra. What emerged, however, was silence. Not a single surviving sequence of ancient DNA. The climate of Flores had worked too well at its quiet task of erasure. Heat, humidity, and microorganisms had shredded the delicate genetic strands beyond recovery. Later analyses suggested that the wrong parts of the tooth had been sampled, and that the high-speed drilling likely generated enough friction to destroy what little DNA might have lingered. Every experiment since has ended the same way: nothing. This absence creates a strange paradox. We know Homo FLORESIENSIS existed, yet we cannot anchor them genetically to any other branch of the human tree. With Neanderthals, we can trace the exact percentage of their legacy in our blood. With Denisovans, we can follow their migration across Asia by the echoes in our genomes. But the Hobbits left no such trace. If they ever met our ancestors, their genes left no mark in us. They are the purest ghosts of the Pleistocene, visible in bone, invisible in blood. Scientists, undeterred, turned to comparative anatomy to fill the void that genetics left. Through hundreds of measurements, statistical models, and CT scans, they searched for kinship in shape rather than sequence. Many found comfort in the Homo erectus connection. The cranial proportions and tooth structure of the Liang Bua fossils matched scaled-down versions of early Javanese Homo erectus, whose remains date to nearly 1 million years earlier. The hypothesis formed naturally. A population of Homo erectus reached Flores long ago, became stranded, and over countless generations shrank in size. A textbook case of island dwarfism, where limited resources favour smaller, more energy-efficient bodies. The logic fit the landscape. But other scientists noticed something deeper, more puzzling. Some features of the Hobbit's anatomy were not just smaller, they were older. The flared pelvis, curved fingers, and low, broad feet resembled species from over 2 million years ago, more akin to Homo habilis, or even Australopithecus. That posed an evolutionary riddle. Could such ancient traits have reappeared in a dwarfed Homo erectus? Or were these fossils evidence of a lineage that branched off from humanity much earlier, preserving primitive characteristics long after their relatives elsewhere had moved on? The debate split research teams across the globe. At conferences in the late 2010s, slides flickered between competing family trees. One showed the Hobbits nestled beside Homo erectus, their small stature the predictable outcome of isolation. Another traced them to a more archaic route, implying that a far older form of human had somehow crossed oceans from Africa to Southeast Asia long before Homo erectus ever left. Both possibilities seemed improbable, yet both were plausible in their own way. Without DNA, anatomy had to speak, and it spoke in riddles. Then, in 2016, a discovery at Mata Menge in the Soa Basin of Flores changed the tone of the conversation. Archaeologists uncovered tiny jawbones and teeth dating back roughly 700,000 years, long before the Hobbits of Liang Bua. These fossils belonged to humans even smaller than those later individuals, but with remarkably similar features. The find proved that the miniaturization had ancient roots. Homo floresiensis wasn't a sudden accident of the late Pleistocene. It was the continuation of a long, stable lineage adapted to island life. The case for descent from Homo erectus, or at least an early offshoot of it, gained new strength. Flores had been home to little humans for hundreds of millennia. The island wasn't just a trap of isolation, It was a cradle of persistence. Still, mysteries remain. The absence of DNA doesn't just obscure ancestry, it erases voices we desperately want to hear. We don't know if Homo floresiensis and Homo sapiens ever met face to face. We don't know what their vocal cords sounded like, or whether their brain structure supported speech or song. We can only infer behaviour from bones, and bones are silent about minds. The fossils hold enough information to prove they were human, but not enough to show us how human they were. It's a strange threshold, to know someone existed and yet remain unable to picture their thoughts. In the same decade, a related shock came from another island. In the Philippines, researchers announced the discovery of Homo luzonensis in 2019, another small-bodied, anatomically mosaic human species that had lived tens of thousands of years ago. Like the Hobbits, they showed a perplexing combination of ancient and modern traits. Their existence confirmed that island isolation had shaped human evolution multiple times in Southeast Asia. The region, once considered peripheral to the main story of human migration, began to look like a laboratory of evolutionary experiments, places where small populations adapted in unpredictable ways, diverging from the continental norm. Together, these island discoveries suggest that evolution's creativity didn't end with us. It continued in pockets of isolation, generating forms that defy linear storytelling. Some scientists call them eco-species, evolutionary reverberations that reveal how many variations humanity tried before arriving at our particular form. Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis remind us that even near the end of the Pleistocene, nature was still drafting new blueprints. As of the 2020s, no new DNA has surfaced from Flores. Technology may one day overcome the decay of tropical climates, perhaps through proteomics, which reads surviving fragments of ancient proteins when DNA is gone. But for now, the Hobbits remain outside the reach of genetics. It is humbling to realise that in an age when we can sequence the genomes of extinct lions and mammoths, we cannot yet hear the molecular voice of our smallest kin. Their story must be told the old way, through the patient interpretation of bones, stones, and context, and maybe that is fitting. The Hobbits lived without writing, without lasting architecture, without fire that left much trace. Their memory, too, survives without code, just imprints in stone and silence. They remain the ghost branch of the human tree, unseen but undeniable. The bones in Liang Bua are enough to prove that our species was not alone even late in the Ice Age, and that intelligence, in whatever form it took, evolved more than once. Science continues to sift their ashes, and each failed DNA extraction, each CT scan, each new fossil adds a piece to a story that refuses completion. We have learned that humanity was never a single straight line, but a web of branches, many ending abruptly, some never touching ours. The Hobbits' absence in our genomes doesn't erase them, it sharpens their mystery. They are the unwritten chapter that forces us to admit how much of our own origin remains in the dark. Imagine standing at the mouth of Liang Bua Cave at twilight. The air is still, except for the drip of water echoing from the limestone ceiling. Bats stir in the shadows, and the rainforest beyond hums with unseen life. You know that, long ago, this quiet place was alive with voices. High, quick, human voices, speaking in tones we'll never hear again. The floor beneath your feet once held the footprints of a species that built no cities, left no writing, and shaped no empires, but endured here for hundreds of thousands of years. They were small, but their story is vast. On this remote island, cut off from the rest of the world, humanity tried one of its boldest experiments, and for a time, it worked. The story of Homo floresiensis is a study in humility. For most of history, we assumed that the human story was a single rising line, from primitive to advanced, from simple to sophisticated, a march toward the inevitability of us. But the Hobbits remind us that this was never true. 50,000 years ago, as our own species spread across continents, there were still others. Neanderthals in Europe, Descendants in Asia, and these small beings here in the forests of Flores. For a while, Earth held more than one kind of human. Each had its own solutions, its own way of being. We were not the endpoint of evolution, merely one of its surviving threads. The Hobbit's existence humbles the myth of our uniqueness. They remind us that intelligence, endurance, and imagination are not monopolies of size or power. They are survival strategies expressed in many forms. Isolation shaped them. On a small island surrounded by deep seas, evolution rewrote the rules. Resources were scarce, predators rare, and over generations body adapted to fit the island's limits. Yet, in their reduced size, something extraordinary persisted. Cognition, coordination, the ability to make tools and navigate a dangerous world. Their small brains did not condemn them to simplicity. Instead, they reveal evolution's efficiency, how mind and body can adjust in balance. What we see in Homo Floresiensis is not a failure of development but a different kind of success, one sculpted by necessity. Theirs was an existence that proved survival doesn't always favour the biggest or the strongest. Sometimes it rewards the ones who waste the least. But the story is also about fragility. For all their endurance, the Hobbits eventually vanished. Whether by climate's whim, volcanic fury, or our own ancestors' arrival, their line came to an end. In that disappearance lies a warning. Species can thrive for nearly 1 million years and still vanish within a geological blink. Survival is never guaranteed. We often look at prehistory as a stage that led to us, as though we were inevitable. Yet the fossils in Liang Bua whisper otherwise. Every species, even ours, lives on borrowed time. The balance between adaptation and extinction is delicate, and the island of Flores was a microcosm of that truth. One shift in weather, one eruption, one stranger arriving with new tools, and the thread can snap. Still, what a thread it was. To imagine Homo Floresiensis is to imagine ingenuity without abundance. They lived without excess. No metal, no permanent fire, no art that we know of, yet they endured in a landscape full of danger and scarcity. They hunted giant rats, avoided dragons, and adapted to every change the island threw at them. They found stability in a place that should have been impossible. In their simplicity lies an echo of what early humanity once was, not rulers of the world, but participants in its rhythms. Their lives were fragile but sustainable, small in scale but infinite in meaning. The Hobbits also remind us of the luck that governs discovery. For hundreds of centuries they lay in silence beneath the cave floor, unknown to the world. Their story could have stayed buried forever, erased by time and erosion. It took a few patient archaeologists, a brush, and a moment of persistence to bring them back into light. How many others wait beneath our feet? Forgotten branches of the human family sealed in stone. Each discovery changes not just our past, but our sense of the present. The Hobbits teach us that our knowledge of ourselves is still in its infancy. The Earth's memory is deeper than we can yet read. There's something quietly poetic about how they return to us, not through DNA or descendants, but through chance. In an age of genetic databases and digital archives, their story resists digitization. We can sequence mammoths and Neanderthals, trace migrations across genomes, but the Hobbits give us nothing to scan. They remain mute, their DNA gone, and perhaps that's appropriate. Not all truths can be extracted or graphed. Some exist only in the imagination, in the careful act of reconstructing bones, in the awe of realizing what once was. They belong to that part of science which borders on philosophy, where data ends and wonder begins. What Homo floresiensis offers us is not a clearer picture of human evolution, but a more complicated one. Evolution, they remind us, is not a ladder but a forest. It grows outward in branches, experiments, and failures. The Hobbits were one of those experiments. Proof that life's creativity doesn't follow human logic. They invite us to see evolution not as progress, but as adaptation. Intelligence isn't a destination. It's a method of persistence, and persistence can take many shapes. If you listen closely to the story of the Hobbits, it also holds a mirror to our own future. They lived in a self-contained world, bound by the limits of their island. When the environment changed, they had nowhere to go. Today, our planet is our island. We too live within boundaries, ecological, climatic, and moral. The Hobbit's extinction isn't just a relic of the past, it's a lesson in balance. They adapted beautifully until the conditions that sustained them shifted faster than they could. In their absence, the cave feels like a prophecy, and yet there's grace in their story. Evolution's experiments are not failures because they end. Every species that has ever lived has contributed to the sum of life's complexity. The Hobbits may have vanished, but they added a verse to the song of humanity, a softer, smaller melody that still lingers. In them, we glimpse how broad the definition of human truly is. They were toolmakers, survivors, thinkers in their own quiet way. They remind us that humanity is not a single shape, but a spectrum of possibilities. As we close their story, imagine the cave once more. The flicker of torchlight on stone, the sound of feet on dust, then stillness. The bones rest where they were found, watched over now by the scientists who dust and measure them, their lights the new campfires of curiosity. In that dim glow, the Hobbits of Flores live again, not as relics, but as teachers. They whisper that our species too is temporary, but that curiosity, imagination, and wonder may outlast us. In the silence of Liang Bua, they remind us of what it means to be alive and to seek meaning in the traces left behind. Their legacy is humility, their gift is perspective, and their final lesson is simple. We are part of a story much larger than ourselves, one that began long before us and will continue long after we're gone.